Hey guys, tonight we embark on a journey, not just across the waves, but into the very fabric of fear itself, as we explore the surprisingly deep anxieties of 18th century sailors, particularly their strange and unsettling relationship with mirrors at sea. Picture yourself for a moment, crammed into a dark, reeking hull, the wood groaning around you like a dying beast, the waves outside a constant, indifferent threat. You're months from land, surrounded by men whose hygiene is, let's just say, historically challenging, and your only companions are rats, roaches, and the chilling vastness of the ocean. Survival isn't guaranteed. In fact, the odds are frankly stacked against you, thanks to scurvy, storms, and the sheer unadulterated misery of it all. You probably won't survive this voyage, historically speaking, but don't worry, you're just listening along from the comfort of, well, somewhere dry and stable, I hope. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always wild to see how far these sleepy tales travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the year is roughly 1750. You're aboard a ship, maybe a frigate of the Royal Navy, or perhaps a merchant vessel hauling goods across the Atlantic. Step outside, if you can call the deck outside, when the spray is constantly blinding you and the wind feels like a physical assault. Look up, miles and miles of sky, sometimes achingly blue, sometimes a bruised, ominous gray. Look around, nothing but water stretching to the horizon in every direction. A relentless, featureless expanse that offers no comfort, no landmarks, only the terrifying knowledge that you are an infinitesimal speck upon its surface. Now look down. The deck is wet, often slippery with sea foam, grime, and other less pleasant things we won't dwell on just yet. The ropes are stiff with salt, the sails are patched and strained against the wind, and the air is thick with the smell of tar. Stale sweat, damp wood, and the ever-present tang of the sea itself, a smell that gets into everything, including your dreams. This isn't the romanticized age of sail you see in movies. This is a brutal, cramped, dangerous existence where every day is a fight against the elements, disease, hunger, and the crushing monotony, broken only by moments of sheer terror during a gale or combat. You're one of perhaps hundreds of men packed together like sardines in conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint on the spot. There's precious little privacy, almost no personal space, and certainly no escape. Your world is this wooden box, pitching and rolling across an indifferent abyss, and your companions are men just as scared, just as isolated, and just as reliant on luck and superstition to get them through. Life expectancy for a sailor back then wasn't great. Beyond the obvious dangers of drowning or being blown off the rigging in a storm, which, let's be honest, were pretty high probability events, there was the constant threat of illness. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was rampant and utterly horrific, leading to rotting gums, open sores, and eventual death. Fever swept through ships like wildfire. Dysentery was a constant companion. Injuries were common, and medical care was rudimentary at best, often involving saws and very little in the way of pain relief or sanitation. A broken leg could easily turn into a death sentence from infection. A mainstream historical fact about this era is that disease was often a far greater killer of sailors than enemy action or even storms. Conditions were so harsh that recruitment was a constant struggle, and the press gang, forcibly rounding up men for service, was a necessary, if deeply unpopular, tool for navies. In such an environment, where rational control over your fate felt almost non-existent, it's no wonder that superstitions flourished. When you're utterly at the mercy of unpredictable forces, the weather, the sea, the health of your shipmates, you grasp for anything that feels like agency, anything that might influence the capricious hand of fate. Superstitions, however illogical they might seem to us now, provided a framework, a set of rules that, if followed, might just appease the powers that be, whether those powers were God, the devil, sea witches, or simply the inherent malevolence of the ocean itself. Think about the sheer boredom, too, punctuated by moments of extreme danger. Days bled into weeks, then months, of the same endless horizon, the same faces, the same back-breaking work, the same awful food. In this isolation with limited literacy and entertainment, stories were told, retold, and embellished. Fears were shared, magnified, and solidified into communal beliefs. A strange creak in the hall could become the whisper of a ghost. A sudden gust of wind could be the breath of a vengeful spirit. A run of bad luck, a snapped mast, a man lost overboard, spoiled provisions, would inevitably be attributed to some transgression, some broken taboo, some sign that the sea or the spirits were displeased. This created a fertile ground for all sorts of peculiar beliefs to take root and thrive. A quirky tidbit that highlights the depth of these beliefs is the widespread fear among sailors of having women aboard. This wasn't just prudishness, it was a genuine, deeply held superstition that women brought bad luck to a ship, perhaps because they might anger the sea gods or because their presence was seen as a distraction. While captains sometimes brought their wives and merchant ships occasionally carried female passengers, their presence was often viewed with unease by the crew, and various rituals might be performed to counteract the perceived jinx. The thought that a woman's mere presence could endanger an entire voyage speaks volumes about how readily sailors attributed events to supernatural or symbolic causes. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were primarily a way for sailors to cope with the overwhelming stress and lack of control, or if they served a more practical social function, perhaps providing a shared code of conduct and a sense of group identity in a harsh, hierarchical environment. Was it a psychological crutch or a form of cultural cohesion? Probably a bit of both, honestly. When your life depends on the competence and good fortune of the men around you, believing in shared omens and taboos creates a powerful, if irrational, bond. You look out for signs not just for your own safety, but because breaking a taboo could imperil everyone aboard. The ship itself was a micro-universe, detached from the rules and certainties of land. Time felt different. Space was confined. The natural world outside the hull was utterly alien and often hostile. On land, gravity was reliable, the ground stayed put, and the horizon offered variety. At sea, the world was constantly in motion, the deck pitching beneath your feet, the horizon a monotonous circle. This disorienting reality likely made it easier to believe in things that defied everyday logic. If the world around you was already behaving in strange, unpredictable ways, why wouldn't spirits, omens, and magical objects be part of that reality? The darkness below deck was profound, lit only by flickering lanterns that cast long, dancing shadows, perfect for conjuring up imagined terrors. The sounds were ceaseless, the creak and groan of timber, the slap and rush of waves against the hull, the whine of the wind through the rigging, the rhythmic thud of footsteps, the snores and whispers of sleeping men. These sounds, combined with exhaustion, poor diet, and the constant anxiety, could easily blur the lines between reality and nightmare. You were living in a sensory soup that was ripe for misinterpretation and the flourishing of the irrational. Even the simple act of eating was fraught with potential omens. Dropping food might be bad luck. Seeing certain animals, like rats leaving a sinking ship, though that's more about observation than superstition, isn't it? Or specific birds landing on the rigging could be interpreted as signs. There was a whole complex language of omens woven into the daily routine of a ship, from the way the knots in the ropes lay to the color of the sky at dawn. And into this highly charged, fear-infused environment, objects and practices from the land inevitably brought their own baggage of beliefs and superstitions. Things we consider commonplace today could take on entirely new, often ominous, meanings when transplanted into the strange, confined, and highly vulnerable world of a sailing ship. And among these transplanted objects, few carried as much potential for unease and outright dread as the mirror. On land, mirrors were becoming more common in the 18th century, especially among the wealthier classes. But they still retained an aura of mystery and even magic for many. They showed you a reflection, a double, a version of yourself that wasn't quite you, existing in some intangible space beyond the glass. Now take that object, that peculiar window into another dimension, and introduce it into the already superstitious pressure cooker of an 18th century ship. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as we'll explore, according to the sailors of the time, quite a lot. The stage is set, the superstitions are brewing, and the sea is waiting. And somewhere in the cramped quarters below deck, perhaps, a small, polished surface is about to cause a very big stir. And somewhere in the cramped quarters below deck, perhaps a small, polished surface is about to cause a very big stir. So you're living this life of constant peril and crushing boredom, surrounded by men whose breath could strip paint and whose superstitions are as thick as the grime on the deck. Now into this world, imagine the sudden appearance of something utterly alien, something that doesn't belong, something that defies the gritty reality of your day-to-day existence. A mirror. Forget the seamless sheets of reflective glass you see everywhere today. In your bathroom, your phone screen, shop windows, even the side mirrors, sub-mirrors on your car. In the 18th century, mirrors were a different beast entirely. They weren't mass-produced, cheap, and disposable items. Far from it. Glass-making was a complex and expensive art. Making large, flat sheets of clear glass was particularly challenging. Early mirrors were often made of polished metal, like bronze or silver, but these were heavy, scratched easily, and didn't give a particularly bright or clear reflection. By the 18th century, glass mirrors were becoming more common, but they were still a luxury item, especially anything of decent size. The process typically involved blowing a glass bubble, flattening it, and then coating one side with a reflective material. Often this material was an amalgam of tin and mercury, yes, liquid mercury. Think about that for a second. Mercury, a heavy poisonous metal, sloshing around on the back of a fragile piece of glass. Not exactly the picture of safety and stability, is it? This backing was delicate and prone to damage, and the glass itself was often imperfect, with bubbles, waves, and distortions that warped the reflection. So when you encountered a mirror on land, it was likely in the home of someone wealthy, a merchant, a landowner, nobility. It was probably small, perhaps mounted in an ornate, heavy frame of wood or metal, designed to sit on a dresser or hang carefully on a solid wall. It was an object of value, a display of status, and probably treated with a certain degree of reverence. These were not the kind of things you just tossed into a sea chest or hung casually on a bulkhead. Now consider bringing such an object onto a ship. The environment was brutal on everything. Wood warped and cracked from constant damp and changing temperatures. Metal corroded with salt spray. Everything was subjected to constant vibration, sudden jolts, and violent pitching and rolling, especially during a storm. A fragile sheet of glass coated with poisonous liquid, held in a potentially heavy frame. This was an object fundamentally unsuited to life at sea. It was almost guaranteed to break. And if it broke, you had shards of sharp glass flying around and potentially toxic mercury vapor or droplets to contend with in a confined space. Because they were expensive and fragile, mirrors were incredibly rare on board ships, particularly on naval vessels or working merchant ships. You might find a small, perhaps slightly damaged one tucked away in a captain's cabin. A small indulgence, a connection to the world ashore, but likely kept secured and out of sight. For the average sailor, the vast majority of the crew, the concept of owning or even regularly seeing a mirror would have been utterly foreign. Their reflection was something they might glimpse in a bucket of water, if it was clean enough, which, let's be honest, was unlikely. Or maybe in a polished metal button or buckle, giving only a vague, distorted idea of their appearance. This rarity was a key part of their unsettling nature. Things that are rare and valuable often acquire an aura of mystery or power. In a world steeped in superstition, where objects were frequently believed to possess their own spirits or influence, a mirror's strangeness was magnified by its infrequent appearance. It wasn't just uncommon, it was unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar, in a place where the familiar was your only tether to reality, could easily become freighted with anxiety. Think about it, for months on end, you might see your shipmates, the same worn faces day after day, week after week. You'd see the rigging, the deck, the waves, the scum. Your world was limited and repetitive. And then suddenly, there it is, a mirror. And it shows you yourself, not the you feel on the inside, exhausted and scared, but a visual representation, a double existing on the other side of that cold, hard surface. This concept of the double or the reflection held a deep, often unsettling significance in folklore across many cultures, not just among sailors. For centuries, reflections were linked to the soul. To see your reflection was to see a part of your spiritual self. To have your reflection captured or damaged was, in some traditions, akin to harming your soul. Breaking a mirror wasn't just bad luck because it was expensive glass. It was bad luck because it was like shattering a piece of yourself, or worse, trapping or releasing something unintended. This is a concept deeply embedded in many pre-scientific worldviews, where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was much more porous than we tend to perceive it today. So you're a sailor in the 1700s. You likely grew up hearing tales and superstitions common on land. Maybe you heard about the fear of mirrors in darkened rooms, or the idea that looking into a mirror could show you your future or your impending death. You carried these land-based fears and beliefs with you when you signed up, or perhaps were press-ganged for this floating wooden box. Now you're in this utterly unnatural environment, constantly moving, audit, lit by flickering lamps that make shadows dance like malevolent sprites. And you encounter this rare, expensive, fragile object that shows you, but it's not quite you, is it? It's reversed, it's silent. It exists in a space you can't reach, a dimension seemingly contained within the glass. In the unstable light of a ship's interior, perhaps lit only by a swaying lantern during the dark hours, the reflection might shimmer and shift. Your own face might seem distorted by the imperfections in the glass, looking less like you and more like a stranger, or perhaps something worse. Combine this with the constant pitching and rolling of the ship, which would make the reflection themselves seem to move and sway independently, and you have a recipe for serious unease. It wouldn't just be your image bobbing, it might feel like the mirror itself was alive, or a portal to somewhere else that was reacting to the ship's motion. Trying to look at yourself while the floor beneath you is trying to throw you across the room is disorienting enough. Seeing your reflection doing the same thing in a glass portal? Yeah, that's going to mess with your head. It's like trying to take a selfie on a roller coaster. Technically possible, but deeply confusing for everyone involved. The reflection could also serve as a stark, unwanted reminder of who you were before you came to see, or who you might have been. You look into it, and you see the exhaustion etched on your face, the gauntness from poor food, the dirt, and the weariness. It's a confronting reality check in a place where reality is often best ignored. It's hard to maintain cheerful denial about your predicament when you're literally faced with the visual evidence of your own slow decay. No wonder sailors weren't lining up to get their beauty sleep or check their teeth for scurvy-induced rot using a mirror. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Who's the most likely to catch a horrible disease of all? Probably you, mate. Your gums look like raspberry jam. So mirrors weren't just impractical, they were conceptually unsettling. They broke the rules of the shipboard world. Everything else was solid wood, tough rope, durable canvas, rough metal. A mirror was smooth, breakable, and showed you something intangible. It was an object that belonged on land, in stable homes, and its presence at sea felt fundamentally wrong, like wearing a tuxedo to shovel coal. Not that any 18th century sailor would know what a tuxedo was, but you get the drift. It was just fancy and fragile and weird. One mainstream historical fact is that the cost of glass, and therefore mirrors, remained relatively high throughout the 18th century, making them inaccessible luxury items for the vast majority of the population, including working sailors. This wasn't something you'd find tucked into every sailor's duffel bag alongside his spare shirt, singular probably, and his lucky rabbit's foot, if he had one. Their expense contributed directly to their rarity, and by extension, their perceived strangeness and value, perhaps even imbuing them with an almost magical quality simply because they were so far removed from everyday experience. A quirky tidbit is that while large mirrors were rare, small, polished metal surfaces like tin dishes could serve as crude reflectors. Sailors might use these for basic tasks like shaving, a dangerous endeavor on a rolling ship with a straight razor, I might add. But they wouldn't offer the same uncanny depth or clarity as a glass mirror, thus perhaps mitigating some of the deeper, soul-related anxieties associated with reflections. They were practical tools, not portals to another dimension. Historians still argue whether the specific superstitions around mirrors at sea were unique to the maritime environment or simply intensified versions of existing land-based folklore. Was it the isolation, the constant danger, and the unnatural setting that amplified these fears? Or did the sea create entirely new mirror-related anxieties? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Did sailors bring their land fears with them and find the ship a perfect incubator for them to grow? Or did the ship itself, with its unique challenges and environment, breed new forms of anxiety that attach themselves to already suspicious objects like mirrors? What is clear is that the mirror, this simple object that we take for granted today, was anything but simple to an 18th century sailor. It was rare, expensive, fragile, and carried a heavy burden of existing folklore and suspicion about reflections and doubles. When you placed it in the already tense, isolated, and superstition-rich environment of a sailing ship, it transformed from a mere object into something potentially volatile, something charged with unseen power, something that could disrupt the fragile balance of the ship's micro-universe and invite unwelcome attention. The stage wasn't just set for superstition, it was set for a specific, peculiar dread to attach itself firmly to that cold, hard surface. And that dread, friends, is where our story really begins to get interesting. Or perhaps, boringly, drift off to sleep. So you've got this rare, expensive, breakable, and generally unsettling object, the mirror, suddenly appearing in a world built from rough wood, worn canvas, and the hard, unforgiving sea. But it wasn't just the mirror's inherent strangeness or its link to land-based fears about doubles and souls that made it feared on a ship. It was the sea itself. Life aboard an 18th century vessel wasn't just uncomfortable. It was relentlessly, brutally dangerous. And that constant, gnawing fear had a way of attaching itself to anything that felt out of place or carried even a whiff of bad luck. Imagine being stuck in this wooden box, miles from land, with nothing but a few inches of planking between you and the crushing, ice-cold abyss. Every single day was a gamble. The wind could shift without warning, tearing sails to shreds or flipping the ship on its side. A storm could brew in minutes, turning the ocean into a frothing, monstrous beast that tossed your vessel around like a child's toy. Navigating required skill, luck, and instruments that were rudimentary by today's standards. A miscalculation could send you onto rocks or leave you lost in vast, empty waters. And even if you avoided the immediate dangers of wind and wave, there were the silent killers, disease. Scurvy, dysentery, typhus. They ripped through crews like wildfire, often claiming more lives than battles or shipwrecks. You were surrounded by the sick and the dying, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and the pervasive damp. In this environment of constant, low-grade terror, punctuated by moments of acute, life-threatening panic, the human mind searches for patterns, for warnings, for anything that might give a sense of control or predictability. Superstition thrives in such conditions. Every creaking timber, every unusual wave, every sighting of a bird or fish, it could be interpreted as a sign, a portent, good or bad. And into this highly charged atmosphere comes the mirror. Think about how a mirror behaves on a ship. Even on calm days, the vessel is never perfectly still. There's a gentle roll, a subtle pitch. In a mirror, your reflection wouldn't just sit there calmly. It would sway, it would bob, it would seem to move with a life of its own, independent of your conscious control. During rough weather, the effect would be far more dramatic. Your distorted reflection would be thrown about by the ship's violent movements, shimmering and blurring in the weak light. It wouldn't look like you, it would look like a ghost, a tormentor, or something trapped and desperate behind the glass. This wasn't just disorienting, it fed directly into the existing folklore that reflections weren't mere images, but something else. Doubles. pieces of the soul, or even spirits looking back. The mirror in this context became a miniature, contained version of the ship's instability and terror, a reflection of the chaos both inside and outside the vessel. One of the most potent fears sailors held was the power of the elements, particularly the sea itself. They saw it as a living, capricious entity that could give life, but also take it without mercy. Certain actions or objects were believed to offend the sea or the spirits within it. Whistling on deck, for instance, was a major no-no. It was thought to challenge the wind and potentially conjure a storm. Red-haired people were sometimes considered unlucky passengers, as were women, though that's a whole other complex history involving practicalities and fear of distraction, not just superstition. The arrival of a mirror, this object that belonged firmly on land and seemed to capture or interact with intangible things like reflections, could easily be seen as something that would attract the wrong kind of attention from the sea gods, Neptune, or whatever forces were believed to rule the deep. Imagine a fierce storm hitting. Waves crash over the deck. The mast groans. The ship is fighting for its life. In the dim, swaying light below deck, someone spots a mirror. What might they see by mine? Perhaps a flash of the lightning reflecting in the glass, or the well-distorted image of the chaotic cabin, or worst of all, the reflection of a shipmate looking terrified, magnified, and warped by the imperfect surface. Such a sight, in the midst of a life-or-death struggle, could easily be interpreted not just as seeing what's happening, but as the mirror predicting the disaster, reflecting the impending doom, or even attracting the storm itself. It becomes a scapegoat for the uncontrollable forces raging outside. It's the mirror. It brought this upon us. The fear wasn't just about the mirror breaking, though that was a valid concern given the mercury in sharp glass. It was about what the mirror did or represented in this hostile environment. Breaking a mirror on land might be seen as 7 years bad luck. Breaking one at sea could feel like signing your death warrant and everyone else is on board. The bad luck wasn't just personal misfortune. It was existential, ship-wide peril. It could lead to losing the wind, hitting a reef, or being swallowed by a rogue wave. Then there was the deep-seated fear of the unknown lurking beneath the waves. Legends of sea monsters, krakens, sirens, and ghostly ships were very real to sailors. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were explanations for ships that vanished without a trace or strange sights witnessed in the fog. A mirror, with its ability to show things that weren't physically there, your reflection, felt like it could be a gateway for these unseen dangers. Could it reflect a monster lurking just below the surface that wasn't visible to the naked eye? Could it capture the image of a drowned sailor or a vengeful spirit following the ship? The mirror became a potential window not just into yourself, but into the terrifying hidden world of the deep. The isolation also played a huge role. Weeks, sometimes months, could pass without seeing land or another vessel. The crew was a small, self-contained society, dependent on each other for survival. Superstitions, shared fears, and beliefs could spread rapidly and intensely within this confined group. There was no outside world to offer a different perspective or rational explanation. If one influential sailor voiced a fear about the mirror, it could quickly become a shared anxiety, solidifying into custom or taboo simply because the fear was so potent and the environment so conducive to belief in unseen forces. Consider the psychological toll of this life. Sleep deprivation, poor diet, constant damp and cold, backbreaking labor, the threat of brutal punishment from officers, and the ever-present danger of death. Sailors often lived on a knife edge, their nerves frayed, their minds perhaps more susceptible to paranoia and irrational fears. In this update, a flickering reflection in a mirror during a dark watch could look like anything. A figure standing behind you, a face peering through the glass from another realm, a glimpse of a watery grave. It's easy to dismiss these as mere hallucinations or the product of fear, but to the sailor experiencing them, they were terrifyingly real, confirmation that the mirror was indeed a dangerous object. This is where the concept of the double takes on a particularly dark nautical edge. The sea is often depicted as something that consumes and transforms. Sailors risked losing themselves to it, physically through drowning or metaphorically by becoming creatures of the sea, hardened and changed by its influence. A mirror showing you your reflection could be a jarring reminder of the self you were slowly losing. Or perhaps, in a more terrifying interpretation, it could be showing you the double that the sea might claim, a ghostly doppelganger destined to haunt the waves after your death. It could feel like the mirror was trying to pull something out of you, something the sea wanted. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the reality of these fears is the incredibly high mortality rate among sailors in the 18th century. Records from voyages often show that a significant percentage of the crew never made it back, succumbing to disease, accidents, or maritime disasters. This wasn't hypothetical danger, it was a statistical certainty for many. This brutal reality meant that sailors lived with death as a constant companion, making them perhaps more open to beliefs about omens and ways to ward off misfortune. The fear of death wasn't abstract. You saw it in the gaunt faces of your shipmates. You heard it in the coughs below deck. You felt it in the sudden lurch of the ship during a squall. Anything that might offer protection, or conversely attract danger, was taken very seriously. A quirky tidbit relates to the fact that some sailors believed if you looked into a mirror in the moonlight at sea, you might see the faces of those who had drowned, or even your own face as you would appear in death. This specific fear seems particularly tied to the maritime environment, blending the general superstition about mirrors and death with the ever-present reality of drowning and the countless souls lost to the deep. Moonlight, often associated with mystery and the supernatural, combined with the mirror and the watery graveyard below, created a potent recipe for terror. It's like a horror movie jump scare built into your everyday life, except the monster is the ocean and its victims. Historians still argue whether the intensity of mirror-related superstitions at sea was solely a result of the dangerous environment magnifying existing beliefs, or if the unique experiences and isolation of maritime life fostered entirely new forms of magical thinking specifically attached to objects like mirrors. Did the ship environment simply amplify land fears about reflections? Or did the constant battle against the elements, the vastness of the ocean, and the close proximity to death create a fertile ground for completely unique mirror-based anxieties that wouldn't have existed ashore? It's hard to untangle the threads of influence between inherited folklore and situational stress. What's clear is that the mirror, already an object of some suspicion, was transformed by the crucible of the sea. It became more than just a rare curiosity or a potential source of personal bad luck. It was seen as something that could actively invite maritime disaster, offend powerful natural forces, reflect or even manifest the lurking dangers of the deep, and prey upon the already fragile psychological state of the crew. Placed in this context, the fear of mirrors wasn't just some quaint, irrational phobia. It was a deeply ingrained anxiety stemming from a life lived on the edge of survival, where every object, every event, was scrutinized for its potential impact on the ship's fate. And this intense fear, these specific nautical anxieties, led to very real, very strict rules about how mirrors were to be treated, or more often, avoided altogether. So you've spent enough time thinking about the unseen forces, the sea monsters, the ghostly doubles that the mirror might conjure or reveal, right? That's the fun, spooky, old folklore stuff. But even if you were the most cynical, hard-nosed salt who scoffed at every tale of kraken and cursed ships, dismissing all that as drunken sailor nonsense, which, let's be honest, some of it probably was, a mirror on your ship was still just plain, unadulterated bad news. Because beyond the phantoms and the omens, mirrors in the 18th century presented a whole host of very real, very practical, and potentially very dangerous problems when introduced into the utterly unforgiving environment of a wooden ship being tossed about on the ocean. Imagine your workplace. Now imagine it's constantly tilting, slamming, and vibrating. Every surface is unstable. The lighting is poor and flickers with the movement of lamps or shafts of light through hatches. There's damp everywhere. Things are constantly shifting. And hygiene? Well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a priority like it is today. Now picture bringing something incredibly fragile, relatively heavy, expensive, and potentially toxic into this environment. That's what bringing a mirror aboard was like. It was a disaster waiting to happen, even without a single superstition thrown into the mix. The most obvious practical problem? Mirrors are made of glass. And 18th century glass wasn't like the safety glass in your car windscreen or the Gorilla Glass on your phone screen today. It was brittle, imperfect, and shattered into wicked, sharp shards at the slightest provocation. And on a ship, provocation was the default state. Your world is a constant, unpredictable heave and lurch. The ship pitches forward and back as it rides the waves. It rolls side to side with the swell. There are sudden impacts from heavy seas crashing over the bow, or the ship bottoming out slightly in shallow water, or just the routine jolts of sailing. A mirror, even if secured to a bulkhead, the ship's version of a wall, was constantly subjected to stress. The frame would creak, the glass would flex, and eventually, probably sooner rather than later, that glass was going to crack. And crack meant shatter. Picture it. You're below deck in the dim, swaying light. There's a sudden, violent roll of the ship. A locker flies open, a loose box slides across the floor. Or perhaps just the sheer force of the motion is enough. Crash. That precious, expensive mirror, maybe the captain's, maybe some wealthy passenger's, has just become a cascade of deadly sharp glass fragments. These aren't polite little pieces you can easily sweep up. These are jagged, razor-sharp daggers of varying sizes, scattering across the wooden floor, getting into every crack and crevice, burying themselves in the damp wood, mixing with the omnipresent grime and sawdust. Cleaning up broken glass on a stable, well-lit floor is annoying. Cleaning up broken glass on a rocking, pitching ship in poor light with uneven surfaces and limited tools, it's a nightmare. You couldn't just whip out a vacuum cleaner. You'd be trying to gather up invisible hazards with a brush and dustpan while trying not to lose your balance and fall into the mess yourself. Shards would inevitably be missed, lurking like miniature caltrops in the flooring. And the consequences of stepping on or falling onto these hidden shards: nasty, deep cuts. Remember that environment we talked about? Damp, dirty, teeming with bacteria. A simple cut on land could get infected, but a deep gash on a ship, far from any proper medical care, what little there was a serious, potentially limb-threatening or even life-threatening problem. Infections like cellulitis or worse could set in quickly in that environment. You could lose mobility, develop sepsis, or be laid up uselessly when every hand was needed, becoming a burden on the already stretched resources. The physical injury from the broken glass wasn't just bad luck. It was a tangible manifestation of the mirror's danger, turning an object of vanity or curiosity into a genuine health hazard. It's like leaving a box of open razor blades rolling around your house. Nobody wants that anywhere, least of all on a ship. But the broken glass was only one layer of the practical peril. The other, far more insidious danger lay in what made the mirror reflective in the first place: the backing. In the 18th century, mirrors were typically made using a process that involved applying a silvering layer using a mercury tin amalgam. Yes, mercury, the liquid metal that makes old thermometers work, and that you absolutely do not want to mess around with. The process involves spreading a tinfoil sheet on a flat table, covering it with mercury, and then sliding the glass plate over the mercury, carefully pressing it down to squeeze out excess mercury and air bubbles. The mercury would then react with the tin, forming a reflective amalgam that adhered to the glass. The mirror would then be tilted or placed at an angle for weeks or even months to allow excess mercury to drain away and the amalgam to solidify. The fumes released during this process were incredibly toxic, particularly in the workshops where mirrors were made. Mirror makers famously suffered from mercury poisoning, developing tremors and neurological issues, giving rise to the term "mad as a hatter" from the mercury used in felt hat making, another industry with similar risks. Now take that finished mirror with its delicate mercury-laced backing and put it on a ship. The constant motion, the vibration, the potential for impacts or flexing of the glass, all of this could cause the mercury amalgam backing to crack, crumble, or peel away. This wasn't just a cosmetic issue that made your reflection look patchy. It released mercury vapor into the air of the cabin or below deck areas. Mercury vapor is highly toxic when inhaled. In a poorly ventilated, confined space like a ship's interior, the vapor could build up. Sailors living and sleeping in these spaces would be constantly exposed, breathing in small amounts of this poison over time. The symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning, sometimes called mercurialism, are nasty. Tremors, the hatter's shakes, irritability, anxiety, memory problems, cognitive dysfunction, gum disease, tooth loss, kidney problems, and eventually severe neurological damage, paralysis and death. It's not a quick, dramatic poison like arsenic. It's slow, cumulative, and debilitating. Imagine a sailor or officer becoming inexplicably ill over the course of a long voyage, developing shakes in their hands that made handling ropes or instruments difficult, becoming moody, paranoid, or confused. These symptoms could easily be attributed to any number of things on a ship: scurvy, fever, exhaustion, the stress of command, or just going native from too long at sea. The idea that it could be caused by the shiny object on the bulkhead, slowly poisoning them with invisible fumes, would likely have been completely beyond their understanding. They might have feared the mirror for supernatural reasons, but the very real chemical danger it posed was likely something they were utterly oblivious to. It's like bringing a slowly leaking battery into your bedroom today without knowing it's toxic. The immediate fear is less, but the long-term risk is terrifying. Beyond the breakability and the toxicity, there were simpler logistical problems. Mirrors, especially larger ones, were heavy. They required sturdy frames and strong fixings. Securing any heavy object effectively on a ship that's constantly moving is a challenge. A mirror poorly secured could break free in rough weather, swinging wildly, smashing against bulkheads, or falling and injuring anyone below. It wasn't just about protecting the mirror. It was about preventing the mirror from becoming a dangerous projectile. Trying to hang a picture frame level in your house is hard enough. Imagine doing it during a Force 8 gale. It's a recipe for frustration and potential disaster. And while not a direct physical danger to the person, the sheer expense of a mirror in the 18th century made it a liability in itself. These weren't mass-produced items you could pick up cheaply. They were luxury goods, equivalent to carrying a modern flat-screen TV or a high-end piece of art. Losing or damaging one was a significant financial blow. This meant extra care had to be taken, perhaps using valuable space to store or secure it, adding another layer of hassle and risk management to an already complex operation. Protecting the mirror might mean neglecting other duties or using resources that could be better allocated elsewhere. It wasn't just fragile, it was flagrantly expensive and fragile. These practical dangers, the razor-sharp glass shards in a hostile environment, the invisible poisonous mercury vapor slowly sickening the crew, the risk of heavy objects breaking loose. These weren't theoretical fears spun from ancient folklore. These were tangible physical threats. And for a sailor living a life already fraught with immediate, brutal dangers like drowning, falling from rigging, or succumbing to rampant disease, these added risks, particularly the guaranteed mess and injury from broken glass, would have been very real concerns. It's easy to see how these practical issues could reinforce the more superstitious fears. A sailor cuts his foot badly on a piece of broken mirror glass and the wound gets infected. That's not just bad luck. That's physical harm directly attributable to the mirror. It proves the mirror is dangerous, making it easier to believe it's also spiritually malign. The physical reality validated the abstract dread. If the mirror can cause this much tangible harm, what else could it be capable of? One mainstream historical fact that supports the emphasis on practical dangers is the incredibly high incidence of injuries recorded on board ships from all manner of accidents. Ships' logs, diaries, and medical records from the 18th century frequently document injuries sustained from falls, collapsing rigging, mishandling cargo, splinters, cuts from knives or tools, and crush injuries from shifting objects. The ship was a dangerous workplace, and anything that added a new, unpredictable source of physical harm, like an easily breakable, toxic object, would have been a genuine concern regardless of any belief in ghosts or curses. Life was short and brutal at sea, and avoidable injuries from mundane objects were a grim reality. A quirky tidbit related to the era's understanding of materials and risks. While they didn't understand mercury vapor toxicity in the way we do, sailors and people of the time were often surprisingly pragmatic about other dangers. They knew certain substances were corrosive or flammable. They understood the risks of working with pitch or tar. They learned through harsh experience how to handle heavy ropes or work aloft. Yet, their knowledge of chemistry and long-term toxicity was rudimentary. So while they might meticulously package gunpowder or understand the immediate danger of fire, the slow, invisible threat from mercury in a mirror would have been a danger they were uniquely unprepared to recognize or mitigate, making it perhaps even more frightening in retrospect. It was a hidden enemy inside a feared object. Historians still argue whether the documented attempts by captains and ship owners to prohibit or control mirrors on ships were driven primarily by a genuine understanding of these practical dangers, breakage, toxicity, cost, or if these very real problems simply provided convenient, rational-sounding justifications for enforcing older, deeply ingrained, superstitious taboos about mirrors and reflections. Was it, get rid of that mirror, it's bad luck and attracts sea monsters? Or was it, get rid of that mirror, it's going to break, cut someone, poison us, and cost a fortune? Or most likely a tangled mess of both motivations, where the practical risks made the superstitious fears seem all the more credible and urgent. It's hard to say exactly where practicality ended and pure, unadulterated fear began in the minds of the people on board. What is clear is that the presence of a mirror on an 18th century ship was not a neutral event. Whether you feared it would steal your soul or just that it would break and put mercury vapor into the air while scattering deadly glass shards everywhere, it was an object laden with the potential negative consequences. These very tangible dangers, combined with the older, more mystical fears, created a powerful taboo around mirrors at sea. And taboos, especially on a ship where shared beliefs and rules were vital for survival, often led to very specific actions being taken. So you had this situation, an object that was simultaneously a sign of potential supernatural doom, a source of very real physical injury from glass shards, and a dispenser of slow, invisible poison from mercury vapor. Not exactly something you'd want hanging on the wall of your cramped, precarious workplace, right? This potent mix of tangible danger and abstract dread didn't just exist in a vacuum, it had consequences. It translated directly into rules, reactions, and deeply ingrained behaviors aboard 18th century ships. Captains, officers, and even ship owners weren't immune to the prevailing beliefs and practical considerations of their time. While a pragmatic captain might focus on the cost and breakability, explaining his aversion to mirrors by saying, "Oh, it's a waste of good money and a hazard," he was often operating within a culture where the underlying, unspoken fear of the supernatural was just as powerful. It's like telling your kids not to play with a potentially haunted antique doll because it might break and scratch someone when you secretly think it's going to summon a malevolent spirit. Both reasons are valid in different ways, and both lead to the same outcome. The doll stays in the box. On many ships, mirrors were outright prohibited. This wasn't always enshrined in the official Admiralty regulations. The King's Navy had bigger things to worry about than sailors' vanities, like cannon calibers and rationing rum. Priorities, right? But a captain had immense authority aboard his vessel. His word was law. If Captain Horatio Hardtack decided mirrors were bad news, whether because his last one shattered in a storm and gashed his leg, or because his mother told him they captured souls, or both, then mirrors were contraband. Any sailor found with one, even a small hand mirror, might see it confiscated, smashed, or even thrown overboard. Imagine the scene. You, a young sailor, manage to squirrel away a small, pocket-sized mirror, perhaps a gift from someone back home, a tiny connection to the world you left behind. It's maybe the size of your palm, set in a cheap wooden or brass frame. You keep it hidden in your meager chest, perhaps only pulling it out in secret moments to check your grizzled reflection or remember what your face looks like without 3 months of sea grime. But then during a routine inspection, maybe by a suspicious bosun or a finicky first mate, it's found. There's no polite discussion. It's snatched up. What's this? A glass bauble? "You trying to bring bad luck aboard, lad?" And snap, it's broken in two or maybe tossed over the side with a dismissive splash. Your small personal item, linked to home, and potential source of reflection, literal and metaphorical, is gone, destroyed due to the captain's or officer's decree, likely backed by a combination of fear and practicality. Even when not officially banned, mirrors might be relegated to the captain's cabin or the private quarters of wealthy passengers who could afford such luxuries and, presumably, the risk. But even there, they were often treated with caution. Covered when not in use, secured with extra lashings in rough weather, perhaps even removed from the wall entirely during major storms and packed away in safer storage. This careful handling itself speaks volumes. People didn't treat a sturdy wooden chest or a coil of rope with such trepidation. The mirror required special protocols, born from its inherent fragility and perceived danger. Sailors, being the ones most exposed to the ship's constant motion and the direct consequences of broken items and poor air quality, often held even stronger views than their officers. While officers might weigh the balance between luxury, status, a mirror in the cabin was a sign of wealth, and risk, sailors generally had little to gain from a mirror and much to fear. They weren't primping for the ball, they were trying to survive. To them, a mirror wasn't a convenience. It was an active threat multiplier. Think about being below deck, squeezed into hammocks strung just inches apart. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, tar, damp wood, and unwashed bodies. Ventilation is minimal. If a mirror shattered down there, the glass would be impossible to fully clear. Every step, every shift of cargo or movement of people could uncover hidden shards. And the mercury vapor? That would be trapped in the already stale, confined air of the sleeping quarters, slowly leaching into the lungs of the crew. It's no wonder sailors viewed them with suspicion, bordering on active hostility. This hostility could manifest in various ways. It might be passive-aggressive, refusing to handle a mirror, giving it a wide berth, muttering under their breath about bad luck when passing by one. Or it could be more direct. A mirror left unattended might mysteriously develop a crack overnight. Its frame might work loose in supposedly calm weather. Perhaps a stray rope end might swing into it during a roll, causing it to shatter. While impossible to prove in every case, it's highly likely that mirrors were sometimes deliberately damaged or disposed of by sailors who saw them as dangerous omens or practical hazards they simply didn't want aboard. A little bit of accidental damage is a time-honored tradition for getting rid of unpopular items in tight-knit communities, and a ship crew was a prime example of such a community. The fear wasn't just about personal injury or bad luck. It was about the collective well-being of the ship. A ship's crew was a microcosm, relying on everyone doing their part and not bringing unnecessary risks or negative energy aboard. Anything perceived as a threat to the ship itself, be it a jinxed object, a Jonah, an unlucky person, or just something that broke easily and caused problems, was quickly identified and often dealt with, officially or unofficially. A mirror with its multifaceted dangers fit this category perfectly. There are accounts, though often anecdotal or filtered through later retellings, of sailors having specific rituals or avoidance behaviors around mirrors. Never look into one at night, for instance, or always cover it if you have to be in a cabin with one. Some superstitions held that looking into a mirror at sea could show you ghosts, or people who had died on the voyage, or even glimpses of the afterlife, none of which were exactly comforting prospects when you were already surrounded by the constant possibility of your own demise. The blend of terror and mundane risk created a powerful psychological barrier. One mainstream historical fact that underpins this is the degree of control a captain had over everything on a ship, including the personal possessions of the crew and passengers, particularly anything that might be considered a fire risk, a weapon, or a danger to the vessel or its operation. Captains regularly searched chests for smuggled goods, alcohol, or forbidden items. Extending this authority to banning something like a mirror, citing its fragility and potential for injury, even if the mercury aspect wasn't fully grasped, was well within their established rights and responsibilities for maintaining order and safety aboard. It wasn't an unusual stretch of power. It was applying existing authority to a new problematic object. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this active avoidance might be found in sailors' diaries or letters, where they sometimes mention jettisoning items believed to be unlucky or performing small personal rituals to ward off misfortune. While specific mentions of mirrors being thrown overboard solely for bad luck reasons are harder to verify formally, the general practice of disposing of perceived jinxes was certainly part of maritime culture. Imagine a sailor tossing a shattered piece of mirror glass over the stern, muttering a prayer or curse, convinced he was saving himself and his mates from some unseen evil, or just preventing himself from stepping on it later. Historians still argue whether the relatively scarce presence of mirrors on ordinary merchant or naval ships, compared to homes on land, even modest ones, was a direct result of official prohibitions, their high cost making them rare luxury items anyway, or the powerful grassroots avoidance and fear held by the sailors themselves, which made carrying one simply socially unacceptable or too risky from a crew relations perspective. Was the lack of mirrors due to top-down rules, bottom-up fear, or simply economics? It's likely a confluence of all three factors, but teasing out the primary driver remains a point of academic discussion. What is clear is that the fear of mirrors at sea wasn't just a passive belief. It led to action. It led to rules being made, objects being destroyed, and behaviors being modified. The mirror wasn't just an object. It was a problem to be managed, contained, or eliminated. Whether you believed it was cursed by spirits or simply a catastrophe of glass and poison waiting to happen, the response was often the same. Get it off the ship, or at least away from me. This active pushback against the presence of mirrors solidified their status as taboo objects in the maritime world, making the fear not just a thought in someone's head, but a tangible reality on board. So you've got the physical dangers, the chemical nastiness, and the very real authority of a captain saying, nope, not on my ship. But fear isn't just born from logic and rules, is it? It's fed by stories, by whispers in the dark watches, by tales swapped over mugs of grog, by legends that grow larger and more terrifying with every retelling. And the fear of mirrors at sea? Oh, it had its fair share of juicy, spine-chilling anecdotes. These weren't just idle superstitions plucked from thin air. They often felt grounded in tragic reality, even if the link to a mirror was tenuous at best, or perhaps added in after the fact to make the story more compelling or fit a pre-existing belief. When a ship went down, when lives were lost, people looked for reasons. In a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was blurry, and where danger lurked everywhere, it was comforting in a strange way to have a tangible cause, something you could potentially avoid. And a mirror, already viewed with suspicion, made a perfect scapegoat. Imagine the scene, huddled below deck during a fierce storm, the ship creaking and groaning as if it's about to split open. Waves crash over the deck, sending torrents of water down the hatches. Lightning illuminates the terrified faces of your shipmates for a split second. Someone mutters, "Remember old Sea Dog Johnson? He said he saw a mirror flash in the captain's cabin just before the Serpent's Kiss went down off the Cape." Another whispers, "Aye, and what about the fancy? They say the mate brought a looking glass aboard for his wife, and 3 days out, the mast snapped clean in two, and half the crew were washed overboard." These stories, whether true or embellished, served as cautionary tales. They reinforced the idea that bringing a mirror aboard wasn't just a minor infraction or a slight risk. It was actively tempting fate, inviting disaster onto the entire vessel and everyone on it. It didn't matter if the ship went down due to rotten timbers, incompetent navigation, or an unavoidable hurricane. If there was a mirror somewhere on board, especially if it was visible or had been recently handled, it could easily become the focal point of the narrative. The mirror became the jinx, the harbinger of doom, the object that drew the ire of the sea gods or malevolent spirits. Think of it like a game of maritime telephone, but instead of a funny message, it's a terrifying one about death and destruction. A ship sinks. Someone remembers someone on board had a mirror. By the time the story reaches the next port, the mirror didn't just happen to be on board. It caused the sinking. It shattered just as the rogue wave hit, or it reflected the face of a drowned sailor. or it somehow angered the sea itself. The details would morph, becoming more dramatic and dire, each version adding another layer to the growing legend of the mirror's deadly power. These legends weren't confined to the forecastle. They seeped into the dockside taverns, shared among sailors from different ships, different nations. A Norwegian sailor might hear a tale from a Portuguese sailor about a mirror-cursed ship, adding a new variant to the myth. This cross-pollination of fears ensured that the superstition wasn't isolated to a single crew or region. It became part of the broader maritime folklore, a shared language of dread and among those who made their living on the treacherous waters. The stories often tapped into existing superstitions. The sea was a place of powerful, unpredictable forces. Sailors already believed in Jonahs, people who brought bad luck. They appeased spirits, avoided whistling on deck, it could whistle up a gale, and had countless rituals for good luck. A mirror which could trap images, reflect the unseen, and was associated with vanity, a sin in a harsh, practical world, fit neatly into this complex web of beliefs. It was easy to imagine a mirror not just being unlucky, but being an active agent of misfortune, perhaps opening a portal to another realm or trapping the souls of the lost, thereby tethering the ship to their doom. One common thread in such tales involved mirrors shattering seemingly without cause, just before a disaster struck. Of course, ships are constantly moving, things fall, things break. A heavy roll could easily send a mirror crashing to the floor. But when disaster followed, the shattering wasn't seen as a consequence of the ship's movement. It was interpreted as a warning or an omen, a sign that the mirror's dark energy was breaking free, unleashing chaos. The physical act of breaking glass, already seen as bad luck in many cultures, was amplified tenfold at sea. 7 years bad luck on land. Try eternal damnation at the bottom of the ocean. Another popular narrative element involved the mirror showing disturbing reflections. Instead of your own face, you might see the face of a ghost or a storm that wasn't there yet, or even your own deathly pallor predicting your imminent demise. These tales preyed on the psychological strain of long voyages, isolation, and constant danger. In the flickering lamplight of a cabin, after weeks at sea, stressed and underslept, it wouldn't take much to imagine seeing something unsettling in a reflection, especially if you were already predisposed to believe the mirror was cursed. Your own anxieties could manifest in the glass. Think about how modern horror movies use mirrors. They're a classic trope for jump scares, for showing things that aren't really there, for revealing hidden truths or lurking evils. That same inherent creepiness, that sense of another world or hidden reality glimpsed through the glass, was potent for 18th century sailors. They didn't have special effects, but they had their imaginations fueled by fear and isolation. Looking into a mirror wasn't just seeing yourself, it was potentially peering into the abyss. And who wanted to do that 1,000 miles from shore during a force 10 gale? These stories weren't just entertainment, they served a social function. They were a way of explaining the unexplainable, of imposing some kind of narrative order on the chaotic brutality of life at sea. If a ship sank because a mirror was aboard, it wasn't just random bad luck. It was a consequence of a specific action, bringing the mirror, that could be avoided in the future. It gave sailors a sense of agency, albeit a negative one. Don't do this, and maybe you'll survive. This felt more manageable than simply being at the mercy of capricious winds and waves. One mainstream historical fact that supports the prevalence of such stories is the rich tradition of maritime folklore and superstition across cultures and centuries. Sailors have always been known for their belief in omens, lucky charms, and unlucky objects or people. The sea is a realm where human control is limited, making people more susceptible to believing in forces beyond their understanding. From the Flying Dutchman to mermaids and krakens, the sea is fertile ground for myths, and objects like mirrors naturally got woven into this fabric of fear and wonder. A quirky or fringe tidbit might be the specific superstitions linked to broken mirrors at sea. While breaking a mirror is bad luck everywhere, for a sailor, it might not just mean misfortune for the individual. It could predict a hole in the ship's hull, the mast snapping, or the breaking of a lifeline. The fragmented reflection in the broken glass might be interpreted as the ship itself breaking apart. Some tales speak of sailors refusing to look at their reflection in disturbed water, fearing it might show their drowned future self, a fear easily transferred to a mirror's surface. Historians still argue whether these specific mirror-related legends were genuinely widespread beliefs held by the majority of sailors, or if they were more like fringe tales, perhaps concocted or exaggerated by a few individuals and passed around, becoming solidified over time. Were mirrors truly feared by most crews, or was their rarity and fragility simply leveraged by storytellers to explain disasters after the fact, tapping into a general wariness rather than a deep-seated terror? It's difficult to gauge the true extent of the belief versus the theatricality of the storytelling. Regardless of their exact origin or widespread acceptance, these anecdotes, legends, and warnings played a crucial role in cementing the mirror's reputation as an object of dread in the maritime world. They provided a narrative framework for the fear, giving it shape and specific examples, even if those examples were more fiction than fact. They transformed a potentially practical concern, it breaks easily, and a vague medical threat, mercury, into a potent, emotionally resonant fear of supernatural doom. And in a world where survival even felt like a matter of luck in appeasing unseen powers, you simply didn't take chances with something rumored to sink ships and drown men. So you steered clear, you enforced the rules, and you definitely didn't buy a mirror before signing up for a voyage. So you have these potent, terrifying stories swirling around, giving shape and narrative to the fear. But fears, even superstitious ones, often have a tiny kernel of practical reality lurking beneath the surface. And for mirrors at sea, one of the biggest, most undeniable realities wasn't mercury poisoning or angry sea gods, but something far more mundane. They were ridiculously, impossibly fragile. In the context of an 18th century sailing ship, a mirror was essentially a disaster waiting to happen, a delicate, breakable anachronism in a world built for brute force and resilience. Picture this. You're on deck, maybe scrubbing it down, maybe trying to mend a sail, or just hanging on for dear life during a squall. The ship isn't just floating gently, it's a living, breathing, groaning entity constantly in motion. It pitches forward and back, it rolls side to side, sometimes violently. Waves don't just pass under you, they slam against the hull, send spray hundreds of feet into the air, and sometimes just plain break over the deck, turning it into a chaotic, watery mess. Below deck isn't much better. Every timber groans under strain, everything vibrates. Every shift in the wind or the waves sends jolts and tremors through the entire structure. It's an environment of constant, unpredictable, often violent movement. Now think about an 18th century mirror. We're not talking about some toughened glass or a mirror glued securely into a plastic frame designed to withstand impact. No, this was essentially a thin sheet of glass, often hand-blown, and therefore uneven and prone to stress points, backed with a layer of mercury amalgam, remember our chat about toxic chemicals, spread onto tin foil or similar, and then probably encased in a simple wooden frame. This frame might be decorative, carved, and perhaps gilded, but it offered very little in the way of protection from physical shock. It was a lovely, reflective artifact, designed for solid, stable ground, for dressing rooms and parlors, where the worst it might encounter was a clumsy maid or a falling book. Take that fragile object and introduce it to the chaotic, dynamic world of a sailing ship. What do you think is going to happen? It's not a question of if it will break, but when. Even if you tried to secure it carefully, perhaps tying it to the wall of a cabin, the constant vibration alone would be enough to stress the glass. A sudden lurch, a rogue wave slamming into the hull, a carelessly dropped sea chest, even just the cumulative effect of days and weeks of pitching and rolling, any of these could be the trigger. That thin sheet of glass, backed by unstable mercury, didn't stand a chance against the raw power of the ocean. Imagine you're in your cramped cabin, maybe trying to shave or just catch a glimpse of yourself. Vanity perhaps getting the better of your good sense. You have a small mirror hanging precariously on the wall, perhaps bought in port as a foolish indulgence. Suddenly, the ship gives a violent roll as it hits a trough between two waves. There's a sickening crunch of timber. followed by a sharp crack. You look up just in time to see the mirror tear free from its flimsy fastening, sailing through the air like a deadly frisbee. It hits the opposite bulkhead. Smash. Or perhaps it just rattles itself apart on the wall, the glass cracking and splintering in place. The result? Shards. Sharp, dangerous shards of glass everywhere. On the floor, embedded in the wooden bulkheads, perhaps even flying through the air if the breakage was particularly violent. This isn't like breaking a modern picture frame. This is brittle, unevenly cooled 18th century glass, breaking into wickedly sharp, jagged pieces of all sizes. And remember where you are? On a ship, often in cramped quarters, perhaps in low light, possibly wearing nothing but bare feet if you're off watch. Navigating a cabin or a corridor littered with glass shards in rough seas is a recipe for serious injury. A deep cut on your foot could get infected quickly in the unsanitary conditions. A hand slice trying to brace yourself could be debilitating. And cleaning up? Forget it. You're on a ship that's pitching and rolling. Sweeping glass is hard enough on solid ground. Trying to sweep up tiny, invisible splinters while the floor is tilting and the ship is vibrating is an exercise in futility. You'd get most of it maybe, but countless tiny fragments would embed themselves in the wooden deck or get stuck in crevices, waiting to inflict painful little cuts days or weeks later. In a world without effective disinfectants or antibiotics, even a seemingly small cut could turn into a life-threatening infection. So a broken mirror wasn't just bad luck. It was a very real, practical, physical hazard that could lead to serious injury or even death. Talk about your reflective analysis of risk management. The simple, undeniable truth was that a mirror was one of the least practical items you could bring aboard a sailing ship. It was fragile, it contained toxic materials, and when it broke, it created a dangerous mess. Captains and officers, focused on the safety and efficiency of their vessel and crew, would have seen the potential for problems immediately. While the crew might focus on the superstition, the officers likely saw it as a liability. A dropped tool? Annoying? Maybe dents the deck. A spilled bucket of water? Wet, but it dries. A broken mirror? A hazard, a mess, and a potential injury that takes a sailor off duty. This practical fragility likely contributed to the official bans and informal taboos. It's much easier to enforce a rule when there's a clear, tangible consequence, even if that consequence is just it makes a mess and someone could get hurt, rather than trying to legislate against supernatural bad luck. The practical danger of breakage provided a solid, rational justification for forbidding mirrors, which then reinforced the superstitious fear among the crew. The rule might have been born of practicality, but the fear was amplified by the stories. Think about what was considered essential or acceptable aboard a ship. Robust tools, sturdy rope, thick canvas, heavy barrels. Everything was designed to withstand rough handling, constant motion, and exposure to the elements. Soft furnishings were minimal. Anything decorative was usually built in and reinforced. An object like a mirror, requiring careful handling in a stable environment, was just fundamentally incompatible with life at sea. It was like trying to set up a porcelain shop in the middle of a demolition derby. You wouldn't get very far before everything was in pieces. Consider the sheer force involved. A large wave hitting the bow could send a tremor through the entire ship equivalent to a minor earthquake. A sudden sharp turn or an unexpected gust of wind catching the sails could make the ship heel over dramatically, sending unsecured objects flying across the deck. Even the constant motion of the engines in later ships, or simply the natural sway of the vessel, created an environment of perpetual vibration. A mirror, even a small one mounted on a bulkhead or sitting on a table, would be constantly rattled, stressed, and subjected to sudden, violent shifts in momentum. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the known difficulty of transporting fragile goods by sea in the age of sail. Shipping lists and insurance documents from the period show that goods like glass, ceramics, and mirrors were notoriously prone to breakage during transit. Special packing was required, and even then, significant losses were expected. This wasn't just a sailor's superstition, it was a recognized commercial risk. Merchants shipping mirrors knew they were taking a gamble on the journey, because ships were simply not stable platforms for such delicate items. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this fragility might involve specific accounts of mirror breakages preceding minor, non-supernatural misfortunes. Perhaps a sailor's small, smuggled mirror broke, and then later that day he tripped over a coil of rope and sprained his ankle. The breakage itself wasn't the direct cause of sinking, but it was a memorable incident tied to a later, mundane injury. Such occurrences, while not supernatural, would still reinforce the idea that mirrors were simply bad news to have around, attracting trouble in various forms, even if it was just the trouble of dealing with broken glass and a sprained ankle. Historians still argue whether the practical concerns about fragility and mess were the primary driver behind official prohibitions, with superstition being a secondary reinforcing factor, or if the deep-seated, older superstitions about mirrors and reflections were the root cause, with the practical problem simply adding to the list of reasons to fear them. Was the rule no mirrors initially because they break easily and cause injuries, and the fear grew from there? Or was it mirrors are bad luck and attract evil, with the fact that they break easily just confirming their inherent unsuitability for sea life? It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario when trying to untangle rational precaution from irrational fear in historical context. Regardless of which came first, the practical reality of a mirror's fragility on an unstable ship provided a constant, tangible threat. It wasn't just a theoretical risk or a far-fetched legend. It was something that could and would happen if a mirror was brought aboard and exposed to the rigors of the voyage. This undeniable physical vulnerability of the object made the fear of mirrors at sea deeply practical, not just mystical. It reinforced the idea that a mirror was an object that did not belong in the maritime world, an intruder from a stable, land-based existence that would inevitably self-destruct in the face of the ocean's power, potentially taking you down with it, one sharp shard at a time. So you had legends, you had toxic fears, and you had the simple, terrifying truth that these things would just break everywhere, all the time. So you had the spooky legends, the unsettling whispers of toxic backing, and the very real, very sharp danger of them just smashing into a million pieces. But maybe, just maybe, there was another layer to this fear, one that wasn't about ghosts or poison or even cuts, but about something far more subtle, something that struck at the very heart of what it meant to be a sailor in the 18th century. Mirrors weren't just objects, they were symbols. And in the world of a sailing ship, they symbolized things that were utterly alien, and perhaps even unwelcome. Think about what a mirror represented on land during this period. Unless you were peering into a still pond or a highly polished piece of metal, which was rare and probably distorted anyway, seeing a clear, true reflection of yourself was a luxury. Mirrors were expensive, prohibitively so for most ordinary people. They were made of precious glass, often imported, backed with costly, complicated-to-apply materials like mercury amalgam. Again, remember how tricky and dangerous that whole process was? Then they were framed, sometimes in elaborate gilded wood, turning them into pieces of furniture or decorative art in themselves. A large, good-quality mirror in an 18th century home wasn't just for checking your teeth, it was a statement. It said, I have wealth, I have status, I live a life of comfort and refinement, where such delicate, non-essential items are part of my everyday existence. They belonged in grand houses, in the dressing rooms of ladies and gentlemen, in places far, far removed from the rough, brutal reality of a sailing ship. Now imagine bringing one of these symbols of wealth, status, and land-based luxury aboard a ship. A ship was a world unto itself, a hierarchical but intensely communal, practical environment. Space was cramped, possessions were few and functional, and life was dictated by the rhythms of the sea and the demands of the work. There was very little room, physically or culturally, for ostentation. What you owned tended to be what you needed. Tough clothes, a knife, a sea chest with maybe a few letters or small mementos, perhaps a personal eating utensil. Anything that didn't serve a practical purpose, anything that screamed, I'm rich and special, would likely stick out like a sore thumb, and not in a good way. Bringing a mirror aboard, particularly a noticeable one, could easily be interpreted by your fellow sailors and even the officers, as an act of vanity. And vanity, while perhaps tolerated on land among the upper classes, was not a quality much admired at sea. A sailor's life demanded focus, self-reliance, and a willingness to subordinate personal comfort and appearance to the needs of the ship and the crew. Spending time preening or admiring yourself in a mirror might be seen as frivolous, self-indulgent, and even a distraction from your duties. The sea demanded humility. You were constantly reminded of your insignificance in the face of nature's power. An object that encouraged you to focus on your own image, to admire your own reflection, flew in the face of that necessary humility. It was, in a sense, a challenge to the ship's own culture, a culture that valued grit, resilience, and communal identity over individual display. Consider the psychological impact in a close-quarters environment. On a ship, you live cheek by jowl with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other men and occasionally women, but mostly men. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Bringing a mirror, an object inherently tied to private self-contemplation and personal appearance, into this intensely public communal space could feel jarring. It was like bringing your fancy porcelain teacups to a rough-and-tumble pub brawl. They just didn't fit. It wasn't just about showing off wealth. It was about introducing a concept, personal vanity and private reflection, that was at odds with the collective identity forged in the crucible of shared hardship and danger. This aspect of mirrors as symbols of vanity and status could tie into existing superstitions. Maybe the sea gods or the elements were offended by such displays of human pride. After all, didn't the ancient myths warn against hubris, against thinking you were too important or too beautiful or too strong to be humbled by fate? A mirror could be seen as inviting the attention of malevolent forces precisely because it encouraged such self-importance. It was a target, a visible sign of human arrogance daring to flaunt itself in the face of the ocean's awesome power. You're worried about mermaids luring you to your doom? Maybe they're attracted by the shimmering reflection of your vanity. Okay, maybe not quite that literal, but you get the drift. It was about not rocking the boat, both literally and metaphorically. A mainstream historical fact that supports this is the general Spartan nature of sailors' personal possessions aboard ship during this period. Space was incredibly limited. A sailor's entire worldly goods might be contained within a single small chest. Any item considered non-essential or bulky would be discouraged or forbidden. While officers might have slightly larger quarters and more personal items, even their cabins were small and functional compared to equivalent spaces on land. A mirror, being relatively large and fragile, would immediately raise eyebrows not just for its potential to break, but also for taking up valuable space and representing a level of personal indulgence rarely seen below the captain's quarters. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this idea of mirrors and vanity might be found in period satirical literature or caricatures of sailors on shore leave. Sometimes depictions of newly paid sailors indulging in excessive drinking and frivolous purchases, trying to ape the manners of the gentry, might include them gawking at themselves in mirrors in taverns or shops. This suggests that even among the land-based population, the idea of a sailor being overly concerned with his appearance was seen as something of a joke or a sign of naivete, a man out of his element. This kind of cultural attitude could easily translate into disapproval or mockery if a sailor brought such an item aboard his own ship. Historians still argue whether the practical dangers of breakage and toxicity were the primary drivers of the fear and prohibitions, with the symbolic issues of vanity and status being secondary concerns, or if the deep-seated discomfort with mirrors as symbols of luxury and self-absorption in a collectivist, pragmatic environment like a ship was a significant, perhaps even dominant, factor from the start. Was the rule no mirrors mainly because they were expensive and fragile status symbols that disrupted the ship's social dynamic, and the practical dangers were just convenient excuses? Or was it primarily because they were dangerous objects, and their association with unwanted traits like vanity simply added to the reasons to dislike them? It's tough to say which layer of discomfort held the most weight in the minds of sailors and captains. Think about how sailors often adopted unique clothing styles or tattoos, forms of personal expression, yes, but often group-based or drawing on shared maritime symbols. This was identity expressed collectively or through items earned by experience, not through displaying expensive objects bought with money. A mirror was an object that encouraged solitary focus on the self, on the surface appearance, rather than on the shared identity of the crew or the internal qualities needed to survive at sea. It was a reminder of the land-based world, with its different values and hierarchies, a world many sailors had left behind, either by choice or necessity. Bringing that world aboard, piece by piece, perhaps felt like inviting its complications and its softness into a place that needed to be hard, focused, and unified. So while the shattering glass and the mercury fumes were undoubtedly frightening on a visceral level, the fear of mirrors might also have been rooted in a deeper cultural unease. They were symbols of a life that didn't belong on a ship, of values that were alien to the maritime world. They represented vanity in a place that demanded humility, luxury in a place defined by hardship, and individualism in a place built on collective survival. Perhaps the fear wasn't just about the object itself, but about what it represented, about the discomfort it created by bringing a piece of the outside world, with its jarringly different priorities, into the tightly controlled, self-contained universe of the ship. It was an object that didn't understand the rules, didn't respect the environment, and whose very presence felt like a challenge to the unwritten code of the sea. And in a world where superstition was rife and practicality was paramount, anything that felt so fundamentally wrong could easily become an object of fear, shunned not just for its potential to cause physical harm, but for its perceived ability to invite social discord or supernatural displeasure. So you had the symbols of vanity and soft living clashing with the hard communal reality of the ship, the very real danger of poisonous fumes and flying shards of glass, and the general background hum of bad luck. But for the 18th century sailor, whose world was already brimming with unseen forces and potential doom lurking beneath the waves or in the creaking timbers, mirrors could take on even more terrifying, specific connotations. They weren't just generally bad news. They were gateways, invitations, or tools for specific kinds of misfortune. Remember those mermaids we talked about? The ones who could lure sailors to their watery graves with their siren songs and deceptive beauty? Well, some folklore intertwined mirrors directly with these mythical creatures. Mermaids were often depicted with mirrors and combs, admiring their own reflection in the waves or with a hand mirror. They were creatures of vanity and surface beauty, using these tools to enhance their allure, an allure that was ultimately deadly to human men. So bringing a mirror aboard wasn't just inviting vanity among the crew, it was like bringing a piece of the mermaid's own kit into your confined wooden box. It was associating your ship, your home, with the very beings whose purpose was to destroy you. It was almost a form of sympathetic magic, inviting their attention, their malevolence, onto your vessel. You were essentially decorating your ship with mermaid bait. This wasn't helped by the fact that mirrors, particularly good ones, shimmered and caught the light in a way that was utterly unnatural and eye-catching at sea. The ocean surface itself was a vast, shifting, ever-changing reflection of the sky. But a fixed, artificial reflection like that in a mirror felt wrong, disruptive. It was a tiny, glittering anomaly in a world of natural movement in muted colors. Perhaps it was thought that this eternatural shimmer, this fixed point of light, could attract unwanted attention from things that dwelt beneath the surface, things drawn to disturbance or unnatural phenomena. It was like shining a flashlight into the dark corners of the ocean's superstitions. Hey, you can almost hear the mythical sea monster think, "What's this shiny thing? Looks interesting. Let's go check it out." It was an unnecessary risk in a life already full of them. Then there was the fear of ghosts and restless spirits. Ships were often places of death. Men fell from masts, were swept overboard, succumbed to disease, or were killed in battle or accidents. The belief in ghosts, particularly the ghosts of those who died violently or far from home, was widespread among sailors. These spirits were thought to linger, haunting the decks and rigging, sometimes seeking vengeance, sometimes just lost and sorrowful. A common superstition in many cultures, including those sailors would have come from, was that mirrors could trap souls or reflect things the living eye couldn't see, like spirits. Bringing a mirror aboard a ship that might already be carrying spectral passengers felt incredibly risky. What if it trapped the soul of a dead shipmate? What if it showed you the ghost lurking behind you on the deck? Imagine being alone on watch during the deep, dark hours before dawn, the ship creaking and groaning around you, the only sound the wind and the waves. You're already on edge, your imagination working overtime. Now add a mirror to that picture. Every shadow could become a figure, every glint a spectral eye. The mirror wouldn't just reflect your own tired, anxious face. It might, in the flicker of a lantern or the corner of your eye, show you something else entirely. A pale face looking over your shoulder, a ghostly hand reaching out from the background. It was a recipe for terror, a constant visual reminder of the potential presence of the dead. And in a world where fear and panic could be just as dangerous as a storm, anything that actively stoked those feelings was highly undesirable. Keeping morale steady and nerves calm was crucial, and an object believed to be a window to the spirit world was distinctly unhelpful in that regard. Beyond ghosts, there was the fundamental, unsettling nature of the reflection itself. Today, we're utterly used to seeing ourselves in screens and mirrors countless times a day. We check our appearance, take selfies. Oh, the horror of explaining a selfie stick to an 18th century sailor. We navigate the world visually with constant self-reference. But in the 18th century, particularly for someone like a sailor who spent months away from land-based society and perhaps came from a background where mirrors were rare luxuries, seeing a clear, accurate reflection of yourself was still something of an event. It was a moment of self-confrontation. Who was that weathered, scarred, perhaps ill-looking person staring back? Was that really you after weeks or months at sea? The face that stared back might look different, harder, older than you remembered. This could tie into fears about doppelgangers, evil twins, or the idea that a reflection wasn't just an image, but somehow connected to your soul or life force. Losing your reflection, seeing a distorted one, or having it appear when you weren't there could be seen as terrible omens, suggesting impending death or the presence of an evil spirit taking your form. A mirror could become a source of existential dread, forcing you to confront your own changing identity, the physical toll the sea was taking, and the possibility that the person staring back wasn't entirely you anymore, but someone shaped and worn down by the brutal maritime life. It was a physical representation of psychological strain. You left port looking like one person. The mirror showed you who the sea was making you. That could be a deeply unsettling revelation. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the widespread belief in omens and portents among seafarers. Sailors were notorious for their superstitions, seeing meaning in everything from the flight of birds to the behavior of rats leaving a ship. This predisposition to interpret natural events as signs from supernatural forces created fertile ground for objects like mirrors, with their inherent mystique and association with reflections and the unseen, to accumulate a whole host of negative meanings and specific fears. It wasn't just sailors, of course. Superstition was rampant across society, but the unpredictable and dangerous nature of the sea amplified this tendency, making sailors particularly wary of anything that smacked of bad luck. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the specific fear of seeing something other than yourself in the mirror. There are scattered accounts, often more folklore than verifiable history, of sailors telling tales of mirrors, reflecting scenes from distant lands, or showing ghostly figures, or even forecasting future disasters. These stories, while perhaps exaggerated by fear and isolation, illustrate the depth of the belief that mirrors were not just reflective surfaces, but active agents or conduits to other realms that were likely dangerous. One tale might tell of a mirror briefly showing a sailor's home, only for him to later learn his family had died at that exact moment. Another might describe a mirror on a doomed ship reflecting a scene of shipwreck before the event actually occurred. These were not just general bad luck. They were specific, terrifying visual prophecies or visitations facilitated by the mirror itself. Historians still argue whether these specific, elaborate superstitions about mirrors, like attracting mermaids or showing ghosts, were primary drivers of the fear, or if they developed after the more practical concerns, breakage, toxicity, vanity, had already established mirrors as undesirable objects at sea. Did sailors first fear mirrors because they broke easily and were poisonous, and then invent reasons like they attract mermaids to further justify their avoidance? Or did older, perhaps land-based folklore about mirrors being linked to spirits and omens seamlessly transfer to the maritime environment, combining with the practical dangers to create a multi-layered dread? It's difficult to disentangle the cause and effect in the complex tapestry of historical beliefs and fears. Was the mirror truly feared because it might show a ghost? Or was the ship already so primed for ghost stories that the mirror became a convenient focal point for that fear? So the fear wasn't just a simple case of mirror equals bad luck. It was a complex web woven from practical dangers, social discomfort, and specific, terrifying beliefs rooted in folklore and the unique psychological pressures of life at sea. A mirror wasn't just glass. It was a potential gateway for mermaids, a viewing portal for ghosts, a confrontation with your own sea-worn soul, and a symbol of everything that didn't belong in the hard, unified world of the ship. It was a constant reminder of the porous boundary between the living and the dead, the human and the mythical, the safe land and the perilous sea. And in a world where staying alive was a daily struggle, inviting any of that onto your ship through a mere object of reflection felt like tempting fate in the most foolish and terrifying way imaginable. The glint of a mirror wasn't just light, it was a flicker of potential disaster, seen through the eyes of men who were already living on the edge. So yes, you had these specific, often terrifying visions associated with mirrors at sea. The mermaids checking their look before luring you to the depths. The unnerving possibility of seeing a spectral shipmate lurking behind you, or worse, your own reflection showing you a future you didn't want to see. These weren't just vague feelings of dread. They were concrete fears rooted in the folklore and beliefs of the time. But these fears didn't exist in a vacuum. They were amplified and given weight by a much broader, deeper cultural dissonance between the world these sailors came from, the world of land, and the intensely peculiar, isolated, and self-contained world of the ship. A mirror, you see, wasn't just an object of potential bad luck. It was a physical embodiment of everything that didn't belong on a man of war or a merchant vessel. Think about what mirrors meant on land in the 18th century, especially as they became more accessible beyond the absolute aristocracy. For growing numbers of the gentry, the merchant class, and even aspiring artisans, a mirror was more than just a way to check if you had spinach in your teeth. It was a status symbol, an indicator of wealth and refinement. Large, well-made mirrors were expensive, requiring skilled craftsmanship in both the glass and the frame. Owning one meant you could afford not just the object itself, but the space and the lifestyle that allowed for such non-essential luxuries. You might have a looking glass in your parlor, a sign for guests to see that you were a person of substance, someone who cared about appearances and could afford beautiful things. It was decorative, yeah, but also deeply symbolic of one's place in the social order. It was a mark of having made it, at least a little bit. On land, mirrors were also intimately connected with the home, with private spaces, with personal care, and yes, with vanity. They were found in bedrooms, dressing rooms, perhaps in a drawing room where people might admire themselves before greeting guests. They were tools for getting ready, for presenting yourself to the world, for performing identity through appearance. For women especially, mirrors were central to the rituals of adornment, hairdressing, and applying cosmetics. Practices tied to femininity, social presentation, in the domestic sphere. A woman's dressing table, complete with mirror, was a distinctly private and feminine space within the home. Now contrast that with life aboard an 18th century sailing ship. You weren't in a spacious house with private rooms and parlors. You were living in incredibly cramped quarters, often sharing a hammock space with several other men on a rotating schedule. Privacy was virtually non-existent. You ate, slept, worked, and existed cheek by jowl with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other men. There were no private dressing rooms, no quiet corners for personal grooming rituals beyond a quick wash with salt water on deck, if you were lucky and it wasn't freezing. Life was public, shared, and focused entirely on the collective functioning of the ship. The values aboard ship were also utterly different from those on land. Status wasn't primarily about personal wealth or the elegance of your possessions. It was about your rank, your skill, your courage, and your ability to perform your duty. Appearance was secondary to function. Your clothes were practical, durable, and often patched. Your hair might be tied back or cut short to stay out of the way. Your hands were calloused, your face weathered by sun, wind, and spray. There was no social pressure or indeed opportunity to spend time primping in front of a mirror. Who were you trying to impress? The bosun? A seagull? The fish? Bringing a mirror onto this ship was like trying to introduce a foreign object from another planet. It was an object fundamentally associated with individual identity and presentation, with luxury and leisure, with domesticity and femininity, into a world that valued communal identity, utility, hardship, masculinity, and the absence of personal space. It was a clash of entire cultural ecosystems contained within a single piece of glass. The mere presence of a mirror, the symbol of the soft life on land, of individual concerns over collective necessity, felt wrong, out of place, perhaps even threatening to the established order of the ship. The ship demanded uniformity, discipline, a focus outwards on the task at hand and the dangers of the sea, not inwards on one's own reflection. It was as if the mirror represented a constant, glittering invitation to distraction, to dwell on the world left behind, on individual appearance rather than collective survival. You were meant to be a seamless part of the ship's machine, not a person admiring their own face. This cultural contradiction also fed into the perceived effeminacy of mirrors that we touched on earlier. Because mirrors were so strongly associated with women's dressing rituals and the domestic sphere, bringing one onto a ship, this bastion of hypermasculinity could feel deeply uncomfortable, almost like bringing a piece of forbidden feminine territory into a space where gender roles were rigidly defined by absence. It wasn't just that vanity was bad. It was that the tools of vanity, tied as they were to the female world of the home, had no place in the male world of the sea. It felt like a softening influence, a potential erosion of the hard masculine identity that the sea demanded. Consider the sailor's identity itself. It was forged through shared hardship, collective labor, mutual dependence. You were a member of a crew, a cog in the ship's mechanism. Your identity was tied to your role, able seaman, carpenter, cook, your ship, and your service. It wasn't about how good your hair looked or the cut of your coat. Trying to cultivate a strong individual identity based on appearance using a mirror felt not just superfluous, but actively contrary to the communal, utilitarian identity of the sailor. It was like bringing a briefcase to a boxing match, completely the wrong tool for the environment. A mainstream historical fact that highlights this cultural divide is the increasing importance of social presentation and individual appearance on land during the 18th century, particularly with the rise of the middle class. Fashion became more accessible, portraits were more common, and owning objects like mirrors became a way to assert your place in a changing society. Mirrors were becoming tools for constructing and reflecting a distinct individual identity on land. This makes their rejection on ships, where identity was overwhelmingly communal and functional, even more significant as a conscious or unconscious cultural statement. It wasn't just that mirrors were feared, they represented a whole way of life and system of values that the maritime world deliberately set itself apart from. A quirky or fringe tidbit that speaks to this cultural clash is the existence of specific, often derisive sea shanties or sailors' folk songs that mocked vanity or effeminate behavior among shipmates. While perhaps not directly mentioning mirrors, these songs reinforce the communal value system that prized toughness, skill, and disregard for appearance, implicitly condemning anything that suggested softness, self-adornment, or concern with how one looked rather than how one performed. You'd be more likely to be praised for a well-tied knot, for courage in a storm, than for having a neatly trimmed beard or a spotless uniform, which, let's be honest, was probably tar-stained anyway. Trying to introduce a mirror into this environment was practically asking to become the target of such mockery. Look at old so-and-so, spends more time mooning over his reflection than scrubbing the deck. Probably wants to impress a mermaid. Historians still argue whether the fear of mirrors was primarily driven by these deep-seated cultural contradictions and the clash between land-based values and maritime culture, or if the more immediate practical dangers, breakage, poison, and specific supernatural superstitions were the dominant factors. Was the mirror feared because it broke and poisoned, and then seen as culturally wrong? Or was it seen as culturally wrong from the start because it was associated with the soft world of land, women, and vanity, with the practical dangers and superstitions simply adding further justification for its removal? It's likely a complex interplay where all these factors reinforced each other, creating a perfect storm of reasons to distrust and discard the reflective intruder. The cultural incompatibility made the practical dangers seem like portents, and the specific superstitions felt more credible because the object itself felt so fundamentally out of place. So the mirror wasn't just an object, it was a symbol, a piece of disruptive culture from a world that the ship deliberately rejected. It represented individual vanity in a place demanding collective focus, luxury in an environment defined by hardship, domesticity and femininity in a hyper-masculine space, and a connection to the distractions of land in a world that required absolute dedication to the immediate perils of the sea. Its very existence aboard ship was an affront to the established norms and values, a constant visual reminder of everything that a sailor was expected not to be, and everything that the ship itself was designed not to embody. It was a reflection not just of your face, but of a world fundamentally incompatible with survival on the waves. So you had the cultural clash, the idea that this object of land-based vanity and domesticity just felt fundamentally wrong, out of place, even effeminate, aboard the rugged, masculine, collective world of the ship. It was a symbol of everything the sea wasn't. But beyond just feeling wrong, the mirror held a specific, active potential for disaster, particularly when it was no longer whole, because nothing, absolutely nothing, was considered a worse omen, a more potent harbinger of doom, than a broken mirror at sea. Think about it. On land, breaking a mirror was bad luck. 7 years of it, right? A pretty universal superstition, even today. You might roll your eyes at it, or you might still feel a little pang of anxiety if it happens. But on land, in your relatively stable, predictable home, what does 7 years of bad luck really look like? Maybe you stub your toe a bit more often, your car breaks down, you lose your keys, your favorite sports team doesn't win the championship. Annoying, frustrating, sure, but usually not life-threatening. Now, port that same belief system, that same fear of shattered reflections, onto the deck of an 18th century sailing ship. Here, bad luck didn't mean a stubbed toe. It meant missing a handspike as you were setting a sail and plummeting from the rigging into the icy water below. It meant scurvy suddenly taking hold of the crew despite your best efforts with the questionable lime juice. It meant a sudden, unexpected squall appearing out of nowhere that ripped the sails to shreds and threatened to tear the ship apart. It meant mutiny bubbling up in the ranks. It meant battle going wrong, a cannonball hitting home, splintering wood turning into deadly projectiles. 7 years of bad luck at sea? That was less a forecast of minor annoyances and more a detailed itinerary of ways to die. The sheer practical danger of broken glass on a ship was also a major factor. Remember how cramped and chaotic things were below decks? Picture sharp shards of glass scattered across a wooden floor that might be wet and rocking. You're moving quickly in dim light, perhaps barefoot or in thin-soled shoes. Stepping on a piece of glass wasn't just painful, it was an open invitation to infection in an environment where sanitation was rudimentary at best. A simple cut could fester, turn gangrenous, and lead to limb amputation or death. Getting slivers of glass embedded in your hands while working with ropes or equipment could be debilitating. Cleaning up broken glass on a rolling ship was also incredibly difficult. Those tiny, glittering fragments had a knack for finding their way into every crack and crevice. So on a purely pragmatic level, a broken mirror was a physical hazard that increased the already considerable risks of life at sea. It wasn't just bad luck, it was literally dangerous. But the supernatural fear layered on top of this practical danger was what really solidified the dread. The belief wasn't just that breaking a mirror was unlucky, but that it somehow damaged or disrupted something fundamental about reflection, identity, or even the soul. One common belief was that the mirror held a piece of the person reflected in it. Breaking it was like fracturing a part of your essence, leaving you vulnerable. At sea, far from home and familiar protections, exposed to the vast, unpredictable power of the ocean, that vulnerability felt profoundly terrifying. You were already operating at the edge of survival. You didn't need anything deliberately chipping away at your spiritual armor, such as it was. Another layer of superstition involved the mirror as a potential portal or connection to another world, or at least a point where the veil between worlds was thin. Breaking it could either inadvertently open that connection, letting something unwelcome through, like those mermaids we talked about, or worse, or it could violently shut it, trapping something, like that piece of your soul perhaps, or unleashing chaotic energy. The sea, with its vastness, its hidden depths, and its capacity for sudden, violent change, already felt like a place where the natural world was less stable, less predictable than on land. Adding an object that could potentially mess with the boundaries of reality on top of that was just asking for trouble. The infamous 7 years of bad luck also took on a particularly grim significance for sailors. A voyage could last months, even years. A sailor's career was often dangerous and relatively short. 7 years could encompass multiple voyages, major events, even the entirety of their remaining life at sea. It wasn't just a general run of misfortune. It felt like a death sentence delivered in installments. Would the ship be lost? Would the sailor be injured and unable to work, abandoned in a foreign port? Would they face impressment into the notoriously brutal Royal Navy? Would they simply never make enough money to return home to their family? The specific anxieties of maritime life slotted perfectly into the framework of this prolonged period of doom. Historians still argue whether the fear of broken mirrors at sea was primarily an importation of land-based superstitions amplified by the dangerous maritime environment, or if the practical dangers of shattered glass on a ship were the initial source of fear, which then attracted and integrated existing supernatural beliefs. Did they fear the glass because it broke and poisoned, and then associate it with bad luck? Or was the object already culturally suspect and associated with bad luck, making its breakage feel like a confirmation of its inherent danger? It's likely a complex interplay, but the physical reality of sharp shards combined with the potent symbolism of a shattered reflection created a powerful cocktail of dread. A mainstream historical fact that underscores the practical risk is related to glass production in the 18th century. Mirrors, especially large ones, were expensive and technically challenging to produce. The glass itself was often thinner and more brittle than modern glass, and the silvering process could be unstable, sometimes involving toxic materials like mercury. This made them inherently more fragile and prone to breaking than many other objects found on a ship, increasing the likelihood of encountering that dangerous broken state. The financial loss of a broken mirror alone, given its value, might have also contributed to negative associations, though this is less about superstition and more about practicality hitting your pocketbook. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to broken mirrors on land, which highlights the intensity of the superstition, involves specific rituals designed to undo the bad luck. People might gather up every single piece and grind it into dust, then bury it. Or they might take the broken pieces and throw them into running water, like a river or stream, to wash the bad luck away. They might also touch a piece of the broken mirror to a tombstone. Imagine trying to perform any of these rituals effectively on a rolling ship in the middle of the ocean. Grind the glass? Where? Bury it? In what? Throw it in running water? You're in the running water, effectively, but the ritual required specific intent in a non-maritime setting. Touch a tombstone? Good luck finding one of those out here. The sheer impossibility of performing the cures for broken mirror, bad luck at sea likely intensified the fear. If you broke it, you were truly, irrevocably cursed with no recourse. So when you looked into a mirror on a ship, you weren't just risking a glimpse of something unsettling. You were interacting with an object inherently fragile, prone to breaking, and if it did, it unleashed not just physical danger in the form of treacherous glass shards, but also a spiritual or existential threat in the form of profound, life-altering bad luck. Breaking a mirror wasn't a minor accident. It felt like pulling a pin on a spiritual grenade, scattering misfortune and danger in every direction within the already confined and precarious world of the ship. It was a disaster waiting to happen, a prophecy of doom that could arrive with a single terrifying crash. The sound of breaking glass aboard a ship would have been particularly jarring, cutting through the constant rhythmic noises of wind, waves, creaking timber, and the ship's labor. It's a sharp, unnatural sound in that environment, instantly signaling disruption and potential damage. And if that sound was associated with the mirror, that already suspect object, the fear would spike instantly. Every sailor who heard it knew on a deep, instinctual level that something profoundly wrong had just occurred. Something that went beyond a simple accident and tapped into the potent, ever-present fear of the sea's arbitrary cruelty. Think about being below deck in a storm, the ship groaning and lurching. Objects slide, fall, break. If a mirror was somehow still present, tucked away perhaps, and it chose that moment to shatter, well, that wouldn't feel like an accident of physics. That would feel like the storm, the sea itself reaching into the ship, specifically targeting this object of ill omen, confirming that its presence was an affront to the ocean's power, and that the price for that affront was now due. Breaking the mirror wasn't just bad luck, it was the sea's judgment, and that was a fate far worse than 7 years of mild inconvenience, given that the sound of a shattering mirror was effectively the sound of doom on a ship. The logical question becomes, why have them aboard at all? And if you did, how did you manage the sheer, constant anxiety of their presence? It wasn't as simple as just tossing them overboard, much as your superstitious dread might have urged you to. See, while the common sailor possessed very little beyond the clothes on their back, a meager sea chest, and maybe a few small personal trinkets, the officers often had more substantial belongings. They were paying for their berth or were higher up the chain of command with more space allocated. And officers, being often from wealthier or more genteel backgrounds than the average crew member, might have had different ideas about what constituted essential personal items. A mirror, even a small one, was a tool for grooming, for maintaining appearances, for preserving some connection to the land-based society where they held a certain status. They might have felt it was beneath their dignity to appear unkempt, or perhaps they simply clung to this small comfort, this symbol of their identity away from the grime and anonymity of the lower decks. So, while the ideal, from a purely superstitious sailor's perspective, was zero mirrors, the reality was that officers, and sometimes even wealthier passengers if you were on a merchant or passenger vessel, might insist on bringing them. And you couldn't exactly tell the captain, "Excuse me, sir, but your shaving mirror is giving the whole crew the creeps, and we'd appreciate it if you deep six it." Well, you could say that, but your subsequent career prospects, and possibly the state of your teeth, would likely suffer dramatically. So if you couldn't banish the object entirely, you had to find ways to neutralize its threat. The most common and widely accepted method was concealment. When the mirror wasn't actively being used, which given its function was most of the time, it was covered, swathed in cloth, tucked away in a box, turned to face the wall, anything to prevent it from reflecting the unpredictable, often terrifying world of the sea, or from being seen when it was vulnerable. Think of it like covering a bird cage when the bird is asleep. But instead of protecting the bird from drafts, you were protecting everyone from potential catastrophe. The act of covering a mirror would have been deliberate, perhaps even ritualistic. You didn't just casually drape something over it. You might use a specific piece of cloth, perhaps dark or heavy, ensuring not even a sliver of the reflective surface was visible. You might secure the cloth tightly. If it was a small, portable mirror, you'd carefully place it back in its protective case or chest. The idea was to render it inert, to put it to sleep, to prevent its watchful, reflective eye from witnessing something it shouldn't, or from being exposed to the elements in a way that might provoke its destructive potential. This wasn't just about hiding the object, It was about denying its function. A covered mirror can't reflect. It becomes just a piece of wood and glass, its dangerous magic temporarily contained. It was a way of saying, okay, you're here, we acknowledge that, but you're not active right now. Stay quiet, stay harmless. Historians still argue whether this practice of covering mirrors was primarily driven by superstition about their reflective properties, or if it was more a pragmatic way to protect an expensive and fragile item from the constant motion and potential damage aboard a ship. Was the fear that the mirror would reflect a bad omen during a storm, or simply that the storm would knock it down and break it? Again, it's likely both, with the practical need to protect valuable glass reinforcing the superstitious desire to conceal a potentially dangerous object. The constant risk of breakage due to the ship's movement made the object doubly menacing, both physically fragile and supernaturally volatile. A quirky or fringe tidbit that perhaps lends weight to the purely superstitious angle comes from land-based folklore, where mirrors were sometimes covered in a house where someone had died. The belief was that the mirror might trap the soul of the deceased, or reflect the image of the Grim Reaper, or show visions of the afterlife. Porting this kind of fear onto a ship, which was essentially a self-contained world constantly facing the possibility of death, made the mirror's reflective power seem incredibly perilous. What horrific sights might it capture during a battle, a wreck, or an outbreak of disease? Better to keep it hidden, to prevent it from becoming a window onto maritime horrors or, even worse, a trap for departing spirits. Imagine the anxiety if a mirror was accidentally left uncovered during a particularly violent storm. You might feel it wasn't just reflecting the chaos, but somehow attracting it, or even recording it in a way that would curse the ship thereafter. There was also the social pressure. Even if you weren't particularly superstitious, living in close quarters with dozens or hundreds of men who absolutely were would quickly influence your behavior. If an officer's mirror was left uncovered and something bad happened, a man fell from the rigging, the wind suddenly dropped, the food went bad, you can bet the whispers would start. It's the mirror. He left the mirror uncovered. The collective anxiety would build, and eventually someone, perhaps the most superstitious man on board, might work up the nerve to politely ask the officer if the mirror could please be covered, or perhaps even take it upon themselves to do it if the officer was absent, risking wrath but potentially saving the ship in their eyes. The fear wasn't just personal, it was a shared burden, a collective vulnerability tied to the presence of this strange object. So, if you were an officer, you might have a small shaving mirror, probably brass-framed for durability, or perhaps a slightly larger one tucked away in a case. You'd bring it out in the privacy of your cabin, quickly shave or adjust your cravat, and then it would immediately go back into its cover or case. The act of using it might even feel a little furtive, a private indulgence in vanity that you knew the rest of the crew viewed with suspicion, if not outright fear. It was a performance of normalcy, a brief connection to your land identity, immediately followed by the practical and superstitious necessity of concealing the potentially dangerous object. A mainstream historical fact supporting the distinction between officer and crew possessions is that officers' cabins, though often tiny by modern standards, were private spaces where they could keep personal effects not permitted in the communal, open berth areas where the crew slept. These effects could include books, writing desks, navigational instruments, like sextants, which sometimes incorporated mirrors, and yes, personal grooming items. The presence of a mirror in an officer's cabin wouldn't necessarily raise eyebrows in port, but its potentially active presence at sea was what triggered the fear. Even when covered, the mirror's presence remained a source of low-grade anxiety. It was like having a hibernating tiger in the cabin. You knew it was there, you knew what it could do, and you hoped like heck the cover was secure and it wouldn't suddenly become active. The rustle of the covering cloth, perhaps, or the clink of the mirror in its case during rough weather could be tiny triggers, reminders of the potential danger lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't just the fear of breaking it that was the problem. It was the constant awareness of its potential to break, or to reflect, or to otherwise cause trouble. The sailor's relationship with the mirror was one of uneasy coexistence. a truce maintained through concealment and avoidance. They couldn't always remove the threat entirely, but they could try to render it harmless, to blind its potentially malevolent eye. It was a small act of control in a world where you had very little, a way of mitigating one of the countless risks that surrounded you. And perhaps deep down, covering the mirror felt a little like closing your eyes during a scary movie. You knew the monster was still there, but at least you didn't have to look at it. So you didn't just fear the mirror, you managed its presence. You lived with it, carefully covering it, avoiding looking at it unnecessarily, perhaps muttering a quiet prayer when it was brought out, hoping that your caution, your respect for its potentially dangerous nature, would be enough to keep its power contained and the bad luck at bay. Because while breaking it was the ultimate disaster, simply having it aboard, shimmering and watchful, was a continuous low hum of maritime dread. So you've got this highly unusual, potentially unsettling object, a mirror, sitting in an environment designed to be anything but stable and quiet. You've got a crew steeped in superstition, living on edge, looking for signs and portents in every creaking timber and every change in the wind. The stage is set, the tension is building, like a rope stretched taut just before it snaps. And eventually something has to give. Accidents happen at sea. That's not just a saying, it's a fundamental truth of life on a wooden ship at the mercy of the elements. Equipment fails, men slip, things break. Most of the time, these incidents are chalked up to bad luck, poor maintenance, or simple human error. But when the object involved is already viewed with suspicion, already sitting outside the normal order of things, well, the interpretation shifts. Imagine a night watch, maybe. The ship is pitching and rolling more than usual, not a full-blown storm yet, but enough to make everything groan and strain. Rain is lashing down, visibility is poor, and the mood is already tense. Down below in one of the more comfortable cabins, perhaps the first mates or maybe the ship's surgeon, someone who could afford a small, albeit probably somewhat battered, piece of luxury from home, boss. There it is, a small looking glass, maybe hung precariously on a bulkhead, perhaps just propped on a narrow shelf. It's been there for a while, mostly ignored by the crew, but its presence is known. It's a quiet anomaly in their world of rough wood and canvas. Suddenly, a particularly violent lurch, the kind that throws you off your feet if you're not holding on tight. The ship seems to twist in the grip of a rogue wave or a sudden shift in the wind. Below deck, there's a cacophony of sound. The roar of the sea, the creaking of timbers under impossible stress, the clatter of anything not lashed down. And then, cutting through it all, a sharp, unmistakable sound, the brittle, shattering crash of glass. You're nearby, maybe trying to brace yourself, or perhaps you were already struggling to secure something that had come loose. Your heart leaps into your throat. That sound is just wrong. It doesn't belong with the thudding of the waves or the groan of the ship. It's too fragile, too final. You know instantly what it is. The mirror. It's broken. In the flickering, unstable light of a lantern, swaying wildly from the ceiling, you see it. Or rather, you see the aftermath. Shards of glass scattered across the floor, reflecting the dim light in fractured, chaotic patterns. And something else, a silvery sheen spreading across the planks, small droplets gleaming malevolently. Mercury. The stuff they said was poisonous, now loose in the air you breathe, on the floor you walk on. That's the immediate, tangible danger. Sharp glass, toxic liquid. But for minds already primed by superstition and the deep-seated fear of the unfamiliar, the immediate terror isn't just about cuts or poison. It's about the meaning of the breakage. A broken mirror. 7 years of bad luck, they say on land. But at sea, what does it mean when the only object capable of showing you your own face is shattered? Is it just an accident of physics in motion? Or is it a sign, a warning, or worse, an invitation? Panic flares, quick and sharp, like the splintered light from the broken glass. Sailors nearby recoil, some muttering prayers under their breath, others staring wide-eyed at the mess. Someone points to a particularly large shard, its edge reflecting a distorted image of a face. "Look," they might whisper, their voice tight with fear. It shows. It shows the devil's face. Of course, just a trick of the light, the curvature of the glass, the fear in their own eyes projected onto the surface. But in that moment, rational thought is a luxury few can afford. The broken mirror isn't just a mess to be cleaned, it's an event. It confirms the existing unease surrounding the object. It validates the feeling that mirrors don't belong here, that they are dangerous. It's almost as if the ship itself, or the sea, or some unseen force resented its presence and finally struck it down. And now, with it broken, who knows what has been unleashed? Maybe the incident is followed by a worsening of the storm. The wind howls louder. The waves become mountainous. The ship is tossed about like a toy. To the superstitious sailor, this isn't just a coincidence. It's a direct consequence. The broken mirror angered the sea, or the wind spirits, or brought ill fortune upon the vessel. The captain's careful navigation, the crew's desperate struggle to keep the ship afloat. None of that seems to matter in the face of this perceived supernatural backlash. The broken mirror is blamed. It becomes the focal point for all the fear and anxiety generated by the storm itself. Or perhaps the immediate aftermath is quieter, but insidious. A few days later, one of the men who helped clean up the glass starts feeling sick. Maybe it's just a common shipboard ailment, scurvy, dysentery, or one of the myriad fevers that plague crowded vessels. But his shipmates whisper. They saw him handling the broken glass. They saw him near the mercury. It wasn't illness, it was the curse of the mirror. The object itself, even in death, is exacting its toll. This reinforces the physical danger, mercury poisoning, which would have been a very real, if poorly understood risk, but twisted through the lens of superstition. His sickness isn't a medical problem. It's a sign of the mirror's malevolent power. The incident becomes a story, passed from sailor to sailor, watch to watch. Exaggerated with each retelling, the distorted face in the glass becomes more vivid. The ensuing bad luck, more dramatic. The mirror wasn't just broken, it exploded. It didn't just show a face, it showed a prophecy. The sick sailor didn't just get a fever, he was taken by the mirror spirit. These stories, born from a simple accident and amplified by fear, solidify the mirror's reputation as a taboo object, a harbinger of disaster. The captain might order the fragments collected and thrown overboard, a practical measure to get rid of dangerous waste, but one that could also be interpreted superstitiously as casting out the evil the mirror represented. Or maybe he keeps a few pieces, remnants of his connection to home, only adding to the crew's unease. Why does he keep it? Does he not fear its power, they might wonder. This specific incident, whether it involved a storm, sickness, or some other misfortune, serves as concrete proof in the minds of the crew that their fears were justified. It wasn't just abstract superstition anymore. They had witnessed the consequence. They had seen the mirror break, and they had seen bad things follow. Correlation quickly becomes causation in a mind predisposed to seeing connections between the unusual and the unfortunate. Think about it. You're already living in an environment where death is a constant companion. Shipwrecks were incredibly common, a mainstream historical fact that loomed large in every sailor's mind. You might be lost to a storm, run aground, attacked by pirates, die of disease, or simply be washed overboard in a rough sea. Every voyage was a gamble with mortality. When something unusual happens, like a mirror breaking, and is followed by yet another close brush with death or disaster, it's easy to connect the dots, even if those dots are light years apart in reality. The mirror becomes another item on the long list of things that can kill you at sea, but one with a particularly sinister, perhaps supernatural edge. A quirky tidbit related to this fear of omens is the widespread sailor belief in Jonah figures. Individuals who were thought to bring bad luck to a ship, often resulting in storms. Finding a broken mirror might not identify a specific person as the Jonah, but it could certainly be interpreted as the ship itself being marked for misfortune, perhaps due to the presence of this accursed object. It shifts the blame from a person to an object, making it perhaps even more terrifying, as you can't simply throw the object overboard and expect the bad luck to cease. Its effects might linger. Historians still debate whether these specific maritime superstitions, like the fear of mirrors, genuinely influenced sailors' behavior in practical ways, such as affecting their willingness to sail on certain ships or handle specific items, or if they were primarily post hoc rationalizations for the frequent disasters they faced. Did the fear of mirrors cause sailors to be more reckless during a storm because they felt doomed anyway? Or did they just blame the broken mirror after they barely survived the storm? It's difficult to untangle cause and effect when dealing with beliefs formed in extremis. Regardless of the objective reality, in the subjective world of the 18th century sailor, the breaking of a mirror ceased to be a mere accident. It became a pivotal event, a warning etched in glass and fear. It reinforced the taboo, ensuring that any mirror brought aboard in the future would be viewed with even greater suspicion and dread. The silent, fragile object had found its voice, speaking a language of fear that every man aboard could understand, a language that whispered of danger and misfortune, reflected from a realm beyond their control. And from this point on, the fear wasn't just theoretical. It was anchored in a tangible, shattering moment they had witnessed and survived. Or perhaps not survived, depending on whose version of the story you heard. And these stories, these legends born from broken glass and fearful whispers, would become as much a part of the ship's fabric as the salt-bleached ropes in the barnacle-encrusted hull. The shattering crash, the glint of broken glass, the unsettling spread of mercury. It wasn't just an accident, not to minds already primed for portents and punishments. It was a declaration, a stark, irrefutable sign that the mirror wasn't just an oddity, it was a problem. And in the tight, unforgiving world of an 18th century sailing ship, problems rarely remained personal. They became communal, because if one man's strange object could court disaster, everyone aboard was at risk. You couldn't just shrug it off and say, "Oops, Butterfingers," not when the next wave or the next gust of wind might be the sea's angry response to the affront. So the fear, which had perhaps been a low hum of unease or muttered whispers up until this point, now crystallized into something more active, a need to control the threat. And control in this context wasn't about sophisticated risk management or safety protocols, which were pretty rudimentary anyway. Remember that whole crocodile dung sunscreen thing? Yeah, sophisticated wasn't their strong suit. Control meant enforcing the taboo. It meant making the presence of a mirror, and especially its owner, utterly unwelcome. Think about the dynamics of life aboard. You're living cheek by jowl with dozens, sometimes hundreds of other men. There's very little personal space, if any. You eat together, sleep in hammocks swung so close your shoulders brush. You work the same ropes, face the same dangers. There's a brutal, necessary interdependence. Your survival literally depends on the man next to you doing his job, on the collective effort. In such a claustrophobic, high-stakes environment, social norms, even the unwritten ones, are incredibly powerful. Dissent, selfishness, or anything perceived as endangering the group is shut down quickly and effectively. The man who owned the mirror, who had perhaps initially been seen as eccentric, maybe a little foolish for bringing such a fragile, useless thing to sea, now became something else, a pariah, a Jonah, not necessarily in the sense of someone unintentionally cursed, though that interpretation was certainly possible, but someone whose actions had invited misfortune. The whispers behind cupped hands would intensify, glances would become colder, more suspicious. Jokes might be made at his expense, sharp and edged with real fear, not just good-natured ribbing. Imagine you are that man. You brought your small mirror aboard, maybe out of vanity, maybe sentimentality, a small piece of home in a harsh alien world. You knew some guys were a bit weird about it, but you thought they'd get over it. Now, after the storm, after the mirror broke, after the fear took root, you feel it. The air around you is thinner. When you walk onto the deck, conversations stop. Eyes follow you, not with curiosity, but with resentment. You ask for a hand with a rope, and suddenly everyone else is busy, their backs turned. At mealtimes, the space next to you on the mess chest is conspicuously empty. You're still part of the crew, technically. You still have your duties, but you are set apart. Ostracized. This isn't just passive avoidance, it's active social pressure. The goal is clear: make the owner so uncomfortable, so aware of the collective disapproval, that he gets rid of the offending object. "That thing brings bad luck," someone might mutter, just loud enough for you to hear. "Ever since that glass broke, the fishing's been poor. Lost another man overboard yesterday. Wonder what angered the spirits." The unspoken accusation hangs heavy in the salt-laden air. It's your fault, your mirror. This pressure could manifest in numerous small ways. Maybe your hammock is accidentally untied in the night, sending you tumbling to the deck. Perhaps your meager possessions go missing or are subtly damaged. Not enough to be definite malice, but enough to make you wonder, to add to the isolation. These accidents serve as a warning, a constant reminder that you are out of step with the group, that the group wants you to conform to their deeply held, if irrational, beliefs for the collective good. It's the ship's way of feverishly trying to sweat out the perceived illness caused by the mirror. In extreme cases, fueled by mounting fear during a rough passage or after a series of misfortunes, the pressure could escalate. A group of sailors might confront the owner, perhaps late at night, voices low but firm. They might demand he throw the mirror, or what's left of it, overboard. Refusal could lead to threats, maybe even a staged accident where the mirror is lost for him. While outright violence against a shipmate over a superstitious object might be rare and risky, potentially leading to severe punishment from officers, the psychological warfare could be brutal and relentless. What about the officers? Their reaction would vary wildly. Some captains might dismiss the whole thing as sailors' foolishness, a common attitude among the more enlightened or pragmatic officers. They might even punish the sailors for bringing a superstition into ship operations, perhaps seeing it as a challenge to their authority or a distraction from duties. A captain concerned with discipline might view such informal taboos and ostracism as undermining the necessary cohesion of the crew. He might issue a formal order forbidding such behavior. However, even a skeptical captain couldn't ignore the potential impact of widespread fear on morale and efficiency, a mainstream historical fact about ship command. A demoralized or fearful crew is a less effective, more accident-prone crew. Keeping the men calm, or at least manageable, was part of the job. Other officers might be just as superstitious as the crew, perhaps even more so, depending on their background and experiences. A first mate who'd survived a shipwreck blamed on some ill omen might secretly agree with the crew's assessment of the mirror. He might turn a blind eye to the ostracism, or even subtly encourage it. He might advise the captain that, for the good of the ship's luck, perhaps it would be best if the mirror were quietly disposed of. In some instances, a captain might issue a direct, formal order forbidding mirrors aboard his ship entirely. This would be rare, as officers also valued their personal possessions. But a run of bad luck or a particularly potent incident like a mirror breaking might push a captain to make such a decree. This moves the taboo from informal pressure to official policy. The difference between informal pressure and formal rules highlights an interesting dynamic on ships: the constant negotiation between the officer's authority and the powerful, often unwritten, culture of the lower decks. Many superstitions, like not whistling up a wind, callback, or the fear of bringing bananas aboard, were primarily enforced by the crew among themselves, beneath the formal structure of command. The mirror taboo likely existed mostly in this informal space, bubbling up and demanding attention during times of stress or misfortune, occasionally prompting an official response if it became disruptive enough. A quirky tidbit related to enforcing rules and taboos at sea: sailors often had elaborate, sometimes violent, ceremonies for crossing the equator for the first time, led by King Neptune and his court. These weren't official naval procedure, but were tolerated, even participated in, by officers as a way to initiate new crew members and reinforce the unique social order of the ship. This demonstrates how powerful and accepted these informal, crew-driven traditions and rituals could be, even if they involve mock trials, shaving with tar, and dunking, a process that would look utterly bizarre and perhaps cruel to an outsider, but served a bonding and rule-reinforcing purpose for the crew. The enforcement of taboos like the mirror fear operated in a similar realm, minus the theatrical costumes and Neptune's trident. It was about maintaining social cohesion and adherence to shared beliefs. However strange, the owner of the mirror faced a difficult choice. He could stubbornly hold on to his possession, increasingly isolated and resented by his shipmates, perhaps fearing for his safety or facing constant petty harassment. Or he could capitulate. He could publicly or privately get rid of the mirror. Maybe he'd throw it overboard himself, a ritualistic act of appeasement witnessed by a few key crew members. Maybe he'd hand it to an officer, asking them to lock it away or dispose of it. This act of surrendering the mirror wasn't just giving up an object. It was a performance of submission to the group's will, a symbolic act of putting the collective safety, as perceived by the crew, above personal attachment. It was an admission, perhaps under duress, that their fears had validity, or at least that their unity was more important than his property. And once the mirror was gone, what then? Would the bad luck cease? Would the ship miraculously have fair winds and calm seas? Probably not consistently, because that's just how sailing goes. But any subsequent good fortune might be attributed to the removal of the jinx. Any continued bad luck might be blamed on the lingering influence of the mirror, or perhaps the owner, who was now tainted by having brought it aboard in the first place. Removing the object didn't necessarily erase the suspicion or the memory of the fear it had caused. The owner might find it took a long time, if ever, to fully reintegrate into the crew after being labeled the Mirror Man. Historians still debate whether the enforcement of these maritime superstitions, like the taboo against mirrors or whistling below deck, genuinely impacted a ship's performance or decision-making, or if they were primarily a reflection of the constant anxiety and the human need to find patterns and scapegoats in unpredictable environments. Did a captain avoid certain routes or delays because his crew genuinely feared a mirror would attract storms? Or did the crew's fear simply become another factor in the complex calculation of command, perhaps leading to a pragmatic decision to humor them for the sake of morale? It's hard to say definitively how much these deep-seated beliefs steered the physical course of a voyage versus simply shaping the internal, emotional landscape of the men aboard. Regardless of the academic debate, for the sailors living it, the fear was real, and the social consequences were tangible. The taboo wasn't just a quaint belief. It was a force that shaped behavior, dictated interactions, and could make a man's life aboard a floating hell even more miserable than it already was. The mirror, a symbol of personal reflection and individuality, became a target for collective fear, and the man who dared possess it became a living embodiment of the risk the ship and its crew were supposedly facing. And so, through whispers, cold shoulders, and the unspoken language of resentment, the tiny, fragile object wielded a surprising amount of power, forcing conformity in a world already defined by rigid hierarchy and unforgiving natural laws. So the mirror was gone, thrown overboard, shattered and swept away by the indifferent waves, or perhaps tucked away in a locked cabinet under the captain's watchful, or perhaps just pragmatic eye. For the man who owned it, there might have been a strange mixture of relief, the intense, suffocating pressure finally easing, and a lingering sense of loss or bitterness. For the rest of the crew, there was likely a collective exhale. The visible source of perceived misfortune was gone. The bad energy, the potential jinx, had been purged. But did it work? Did the removal of the mirror instantly guarantee fair winds and following seas? Of course not. The ocean remained the ocean, capricious and unpredictable. Storms still brewed, rigging still failed, men still got sick or injured. Life aboard an 18th century ship was still a brutal, precarious existence where death was a constant, unwelcome companion. Any subsequent good luck might be credited to the mirror's removal. See? Told you that thing was bad. So while any continued bad luck might be blamed on its lingering curse, or maybe the fact that you, the owner, had brought its evil aboard in the first place, permanently staining the ship's luck. The truth is, the fear of mirrors at sea didn't vanish in one dramatic moment, any more than it appeared in one. It was a belief, a fear, born of a specific time and place, and it would only fade gradually, chipped away by the slow, relentless tide of change. It wasn't a sudden revelation that mirrors were harmless. It was more like the slow erosion of the conditions that made the fear so potent in the first place. Think about the environment we've been talking about. Isolated wooden boxes, miles from anywhere. Dependent on the fickle whims of wind and water, every creak of the hull, every shift in the breeze, every unexpected rogue wave felt significant, laden with meaning. When your survival relies entirely on forces you can't control, you look for patterns, for explanations, for things to appease or blame. Superstition thrives in uncertainty and lack of control. It's a way, however irrational, of trying to impose order on chaos. But things began to change. Not overnight, not in a single voyage, but over decades. The 19th century brought about a slow, steady transformation in seafaring. Ships got bigger, built of iron and later wire steel, not just wood. They were more robust, less fragile in heavy seas. Navigation became vastly more sophisticated. Instead of relying solely on dead reckoning, basically guessing how far you have gone and in what direction since you last knew where you were, maybe using primitive tools like a cross staff or quadrant. Remember those? Talk about flying blind. Sailors got better sextants, more accurate chronometers to determine longitude, and vastly improved charts. Pinpointing your exact position on the globe went from being a rare, difficult feat to a routine calculation. This growing mastery over location, this ability to know precisely where you were and where you were going, chipped away at the terrifying sense of being adrift in an unknowable void. And then came steam. Oh, steam didn't immediately replace sail. The transition took many decades. For a long time, you had awkward hybrid ships with both sails and engines. But the fundamental difference was profound. A steamship didn't depend on the wind. It could move in a straight line, at a predictable speed, regardless of the weather, within reason, of course. Storms were still dangerous. You could stick to a schedule, follow a route, power through doldrums. This was a revolution. The sea was no longer a master to be appeased, but a medium to be traversed, a force that could increasingly be overcome by sheer mechanical power. You could look at a map and say, we will be here tomorrow, with a level of confidence unimaginable to an 18th century sailor relying on sail power alone. This mainstream historical fact, the transition from sail to steam and the associated improvements in navigation, profoundly altered the psychological landscape of seafaring. It didn't eliminate danger, but it gave sailors a much greater sense of control. The unpredictable nature of the voyage, which fueled so many superstitions, was gradually reduced. When you understand why the ship is moving, when you can calculate your position with precision, when you have an engine that can fight against a headwind, the need to attribute misfortune to magical causes like a reflection in a piece of glass begins to wane. Furthermore, mirrors themselves changed. In the 18th century, good quality mirrors were still relatively expensive and rare, especially large ones. They were luxury items, associated with wealth, vanity, and the strange, intriguing properties of reflected light. This rarity contributed to their mystique, and perhaps made them seem more capable of holding unusual power or attracting attention. But as glass-making techniques improved and became industrialized through the 19th century, mirrors became cheaper and more common. They stopped being exotic objects and became mundane. They started appearing in everyday homes, in shops, eventually even in ships' cabins, though likely officers' cabins first, and practical shaving mirrors rather than large decorative ones. It's harder to maintain a deep-seated, fear-driven taboo about something you see everywhere, something that's just a regular part of life on shore. The mirror lost its otherness. Changes in crew demographics and culture also played a role. As navies and merchant fleets grew, drawing men from more diverse backgrounds, and as communication with the shore became easier, eventually leading to technologies like telegraph and radio, the isolated, intensely insular culture of the ship began to shift. While maritime superstitions certainly didn't disappear entirely, many persist even today in vestigial forms. Their grip loosened. There was less total dependence on the immediate, unwritten social contract of the lower deck, less reliance on shared, sometimes ancient, folk beliefs to navigate the psychological perils of the voyage. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to changing beliefs at sea. While the fear of mirrors faded, Some superstitions proved remarkably persistent, or new ones emerged related to new technologies. For instance, there was often suspicion towards early radio operators, seen by some sailors as potentially disrupting the natural order of the sea, or even communicating with nefarious forces. The simple act of knitting or sewing on deck was sometimes considered bad luck, perhaps thought to be sewing up the wind. And the fear of rabbits aboard ships? That one lasted for ages, supposedly because rabbits gnawed through ropes and hulls. You could bring a cat, but never a rabbit. This suggests that superstitions that had a potential, even if tenuous, practical link, like rabbits gnawing wood, might have been harder to shake off than purely magical ones like the mirror reflecting bad luck. Or perhaps the rabbit fear was just funnier to enforce. Right, Jonesy, is that a rabbit in your pocket, or are you just pleased to see shore? Either way off the ship. It's hard to say exactly why one fear lingered while another faded, like comparing different strains of cultural flu. So the fear of mirrors at sea wasn't conquered by a single rational argument or a brave sailor displaying one openly without consequence. It was slowly, almost imperceptibly, dissolved by the changing realities of life at sea, by iron hulls, by steam engines, by accurate clocks, by reliable charts, by communication with the shore, and by the sheer, mundane availability of mirrors themselves. The conditions that gave the fear power were eroded. The terrifying unknown became a little more known, a little more controllable, and the mirror became just a mirror. Historians still debate the exact interplay of factors that led to the decline of specific maritime superstitions. Was it primarily the technological advancement making the sea feel less unpredictable? Was it the gradual spread of Enlightenment ideals and scientific rationalism through society, including the ranks of sailors and officers? Was it the changing demographics of crews, or the lessening isolation of ships? Or was it simply that some superstitions were less useful, less adaptable, or less fun to maintain than others? It's likely a complex mix of all these things, a slow cultural shift rather than a single defining event. But the outcome was clear. The mirror lost its power to terrify. The image of a sailor cautiously covering a mirror, or the intense pressure on a man who dared bring one aboard, belongs largely to the history books now. It's a fascinating glimpse into the mindset of people living on the edge, constantly grappling with forces beyond their understanding, and using every tool available, from skill and courage to ritual and superstition, to navigate the dangers of their world. The fear of mirrors at sea wasn't just about glass and silvering. It was about the deeper human need to find meaning in chaos, to assign blame to misfortune, and to maintain social cohesion in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. And as that uncertainty receded, however slowly, so too did the power of the polished surface. The reflection staring back from a mirror at sea eventually became just that, a reflection, not a portal to peril. And that, perhaps, is a quiet triumph for the age of reason, slowly making its way even to the most remote and traditional corners of the world, like the rolling decks of a ship far from shore. Now, as the ship of our story sails further into the calm waters of the past, the creaks and groans of its timbers softening. Imagine the moonlight, just a soft glow illuminating the gentle swell of the waves outside. The air is cool and quiet. No more storms, no more anxieties about what ill omen might be lurking in the cargo hold or reflected in an ill-gotten piece of glass. The sounds of the ship are settling, the rhythmic lapping of water against the hull, the faint sigh of the wind in the rigging, the distant call of a night bird. Your own breathing is slowing, matching the quiet pace of the sea. The stories, the fears, the long voyages, they are all part of the history we've explored, fading now into the past where they belong. You are safe, grounded, far from the superstitions and dangers of those ancient wooden worlds. Let the gentle motion of the waves in your mind soothe you, carrying you towards rest. There's nothing to fear here, just the quiet, the calm, the soft darkness wrapping around you. Let go of any lingering thoughts, any images of choppy seas or fearful faces. Just the peace, just the quiet,